On November 10th, 2025, just 72 hours after disappearing behind the sun, something unexpected crossed the field of every major solar observatory. The object known as 3I Atlas had returned. But it wasn't the same. In the last image before solar conjunction, it was dim, dusty, faint, red like a dying ember fading into the solar glare. Yet when it emerged again, it was blue. Not a soft blue, not a subtle tint from scattering light, a deep electric hue, brighter than it should ever be. And instead of dimming as it moved away from the sun, its luminosity climbed by nearly 40%. According to everything we know about cometary physics, that shouldn't be possible. If a comet heats near perihelion, it should release gas, lose mass, and fade as it escapes the sun's energy. But this one, it brightened. For 3 nights straight, automated sky surveys marked its light curve rising, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. It was as if something had awakened while it was hidden in the glare. You might think this was a simple data glitch, a calibration error, another mundane coincidence in the machinery of observation. But identical readings came from NASA's SOHO satellite, ESA's solar orbiter, and 2 amateur telescopes on opposite sides of the planet, Chill in Japan, each confirming the same anomaly within minutes of each other. An object emerging from the sun's shadow, glowing colder and bluer than before. If you've been following this story, stay with me. And if this is the first time you're hearing it, listen carefully. Because from this point on, every frame, every number, every silence will matter. If you want to help piece together what happened, subscribe, share your thoughts below, and most importantly, stay to the end. The truth is never in the first image. It's always in what gets removed next. They say comets are messengers, leftovers of creation, drifting through time with no intention. But 3I Atlas didn't drift. It changed. When an object alters its color, its brightness, and its path, all within 72 hours of vanishing behind the sun, there's only one reasonable response: to ask why. The observatories didn't answer. The official logs remained neutral, factual, detached. Non-gravitational acceleration detected, spectral variation under review. No explanation, no press release, just quiet updates to a public database few people ever read, but those who did notice something stranger still. The metadata of one file, an image labeled VTT 2025-11109, showed an edit timestamp that didn't match the observation window. A revision made hours after the image was archived by a user ID that didn't belong to the data team. When questioned, the administrator said, "Probably just a technical correction." But the correction left no log trail. Silence can be louder than sound. And in astronomy, missing data is rarely just an accident. As the world slept through November's quiet nights, that blue object continued to rise in brightness, crossing magnitude 9.2, then 8.8, pulsing faintly every 37 seconds, too regular for random turbulence, too human in its precision. Radio enthusiasts listening at 1.4 gigahertz began reporting bursts, subtle, repeating, almost rhythmic. No agency acknowledged it. But somewhere between static and signal, a pattern was forming. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's coincidence stacked on coincidence. Or maybe what we're seeing isn't a comet at all, but a decision, a deliberate maneuver written into physics we don't yet understand. The next data upload was scheduled for November 12th. It never appeared. The question now isn't what 3I Atlas is. It's why the moment it changed, so did the transparency around it. Because the night it turned blue, the cameras started to blink. Between October 29th and 31st, 2025, there was nothing. No images, no public data, no radio logs, just 3 consecutive days where every telescope that could have seen 3I Atlas went blind. Astronomers call it the solar exclusion zone, the region of space too close to the sun's glare for any safe observation. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't natural. It was managed. Normally, such a data gap would be expected. Heat interference, instrumental protection, normal procedure. But what raised suspicion wasn't the absence of light, it was the metadata. In one of ESA's public archives, the file Soho 2025 on 1030 out log showed an edit made 7 hours after the observation window had closed. That edit came from a workstation not registered to any known data technician. The comment field read only one word: corrected. Corrected from what? If this were simply a calibration issue, every correction would have been documented. But there were no corresponding reports, no follow-up entries, nothing to explain why a record from the most stable instrument orbiting the sun had been manually touched. The signature of the edit didn't match the usual sequence either. It wasn't robotic. It was human. 3 white days, days when the sky went blank, when the logs went quiet, when the word corrected replaced an explanation. You might not think much of it. But for those who watch these feeds daily, every pixel matters. Every lost frame is a missing second of truth. And the moment 3I Atlas entered that blind zone, both NASA and ESA switched their data mirrors to restricted. That had never happened before for a comet-class object. The archive administrator later said, "It's just an automatic script triggered by solar interference." But the code controlling that protocol hadn't been updated in over 2 years. So how did an old script suddenly know to close the shutters exactly when an interstellar object crossed behind the sun? When independent researchers tried to ping the mirror servers, they found something even stranger. The ports were open, but the datasets had been replaced by white placeholder files, blank images, with file names like empty001 and empty002. Everywhere else, when a dataset is missing, it's labeled unavailable. Only this time, it was labeled empty. Intentional emptiness. Imagine being an astronomer who spent months tracking this object, only to find the window of greatest discovery replaced with nothingness. A white screen where the universe should have spoken, and no one willing to say why. At first, a few amateur observers in South America thought their own systems had failed. They reported white frames, pure static, a sudden spike of light before total saturation. But cross-checking timestamps revealed the same effect appearing across 3 continents, identical seconds, identical whiteouts. Something had filled the sensors with energy beyond their safety limit. A surge that made the detectors blind for precisely the same 72 hours NASA called routine downtime. Coincidence is comforting. It makes us feel the world still obeys its own rules. But sometimes the universe writes coincidences with a pattern too precise to ignore. Those 3 white days changed the tone of the investigation. They marked the point where ordinary scientists stopped asking, "What is it made of?" and started asking, "Why can't we see it?" And in that moment, 3I Atlas ceased to be a comet in the collective imagination. It became something else, a question that observation itself refused to answer. If light is the language of the cosmos, those missing days were a sentence deliberately erased. So we look again, not at what was shown, but at what was hidden. Because when the cameras returned, when the first frames reappeared on November 1st, what they revealed did not belong to the same object that had gone in. When the data finally returned on November 1st, the sky seemed normal again. The sun's glare had softened, the satellites resumed their feeds, and the first post-conjunction images of 3I Atlas began streaming into public databases. But almost immediately, researchers noticed something that didn't belong. The object's brightness curve was off. Its energy output had not only recovered from the solar passage, it had multiplied. Within 48 hours, the reflected light from 3I Atlas exceeded its pre-conjunction intensity by nearly 40%. For a typical comet, that's impossible. After passing perihelion, the closest point to the sun, dust particles usually scatter, ice sublimates, and the comet begins to fade. What we were seeing here was the opposite, a steady surge of light, as though the object had absorbed energy from the sun and was now releasing it back. At first, the explanation seemed obvious. Perhaps the instruments were miscalibrated after the blackout. But when independent ground stations confirmed the readings, that theory died quietly. There was no miscalibration. The blue emission was real. And then came the color data. Spectral analysis from the VLT in Chile, cross-referenced with JPL's automated photometry, revealed a clear shift toward shorter wavelengths, deep electric blue. Not the faint cyan hue produced by carbon monoxide gas, but a more concentrated emission line centered around 475 nanometers. It was as if something inside the object was glowing, not merely reflecting sunlight. The European Space Agency's report was at first careful and clinical. Spectral variants observed, possible photoionization anomaly. But 2 days later, that exact line in the public PDF was changed. The new version replaced emission with scattering. The difference seems small, a single word. But in the language of astrophysics, it changed the entire meaning. Emission means the object produced light. Scattering means it merely redirected it. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet the correction date in the metadata was November 3rd, exactly when the agency's feed was updated with a new logo watermark. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe that was the moment someone decided the narrative needed adjustment. I remember staring at the twin images for hours, comparing color channels, histogram data, noise patterns. Every part of me wanted to believe it was just natural. The comet heated, released exotic gas, ionized under solar radiation, and created a bright blue coma. That happens. It's rare, but it happens. But there was one problem: the pattern of acceleration. The object's motion no longer matched gravity alone. Its speed and trajectory deviated ever so slightly, by about 0.2 millimeters per second squared, the same non-gravitational acceleration once observed in Oumuamua back in 2017. The same pattern that started this entire debate about interstellar artifacts. That was the moment every scientist had to perform what I call the diagnostic ritual, to strip away belief, to confront the data as if seeing it for the first time. The diagnostic moment begins with humility. You look at the numbers and remind yourself that nature doesn't owe you explanations. But if those numbers start whispering the same strange tune you've heard before, you have to listen. When I plotted the brightness curve against the distance from the sun, the gradient was far too steep. Instead of following the predictable R2.5 law for sunlight reflection, it matched a steeper R7.5 decline, then reversed, climbing as it moved outward. This wasn't cooling, it was ramping up, as if the energy source had switched from external to internal. I shared the chart with a colleague. His reply was one sentence long: "It's breathing." That's not how scientists talk. But sometimes the language of precision fails to capture the feeling of the unknown. So what could cause such behavior? 3 possibilities were proposed in back-channel emails that week. Thermal lag, residual heat trapped beneath a crust of refractory dust venting slowly. Outgassing jet alignment, gas release acting like a thruster, changing its brightness and motion. Artificial acceleration, a possibility so uncomfortable it was never written out in full, just implied with a single letter: A. The first 2 make sense on paper, but neither explain the periodicity of the light curve, its consistent rhythm, a subtle pulse every 37 seconds. It's small, almost hidden in noise, but it's there. A cycle. And so we arrive at the uncomfortable question: what if this object isn't reacting, but responding? I don't mean intelligently, not necessarily, but systematically, deliberately, as though bound to a set of instructions. For decades, astronomers have studied comets as relics of the early solar system, dirty snowballs carrying the chemistry of creation. But 3I, Atlas, isn't from here. It came from interstellar space, crossing our system with a velocity that cannot be traced back to any known origin point. That alone makes it statistically extraordinary, 1 in a quadrillion by random trajectory models. When something so improbable then behaves in a way that violates established mechanics, you have 2 choices: either admit we've misread the laws, or accept that something in the data is rewriting them. But here's the danger. The moment a scientist admits that possibility out loud, they step outside the circle of accepted dialogue, and silence follows. The first silence came from ESA's data center. Their public comment thread was closed without notice. The second silence came from NASA's Small Bodies database, which quietly removed its anomaly tag for the object on November 4th. And the third silence came from the night sky itself, when a burst of radiation forced several instruments offline. It's easy to call this paranoia. But history tells a simpler story. Every major discovery begins with something we weren't supposed to notice. What we saw in those early November images was not a revelation. It was an invitation, a signal written in light and error margins, in blue hues and blank files. This is what I mean by the diagnostic moment. It's the instant when evidence stops confirming what we already believe and begins asking questions we aren't ready to answer. To diagnose is to confront. To confront is to risk belief. And belief in science is the one thing we can't afford. Yet still we watch. Because denial is harder when the stars themselves appear to change color. Maybe 3I Atlas absorbed energy differently. Maybe solar wind carved a shape that amplified reflection. Or maybe, just maybe, the glow we saw wasn't sunlight at all. Every spectrum, every log, every gap points to the same uneasy truth. We are missing something fundamental. The universe isn't misbehaving, our understanding is. I think about those 3 white days often. What if the sun wasn't blinding our instruments? What if it was shielding our eyes? Because sometimes the light doesn't reveal, it protects. And when that protection fades, what we see next can undo everything we thought we knew. The data is back, the object is brighter, the silence continues. The next step is to trace the numbers, to follow them where they lead, even if they lead into darkness. Color in astronomy is never just beauty, it's chemistry, temperature, radiation, all the secret fingerprints of the universe woven into light. And yet, when the new spectra of 3I Atlas were released on November 4, 2025, they spoke a language we'd never seen in a comet before. In simple terms, it was too blue to be real. Blue in this context means energetic. It means heat, ionization, molecules colliding so violently that they emit photons at shorter wavelengths. But 3I Atlas was cooling. Its surface should have been shedding ice and dust, dimming into redder tones as it moved away from the sun. Instead, the wavelength shifted further into the blue spectrum, 475 nanometers and holding steady. When data contradicts physics, physics doesn't change. People do. At first, everyone wanted to believe it was carbon monoxide emission. Comets often glow blue from CO+ ions when sunlight excites escaping gas. But the chemical signature didn't fit. The emission line was too narrow, the intensity too stable. It looked more like a laser than a tail. An ESA analyst, under an anonymous post on an astrophysics forum, wrote, "This isn't scattering, it's self-luminescence." The comment stayed live for 6 minutes before being deleted. That same day, the agency's official report on 3I Atlas was quietly updated. The public PDF no longer described it as emitting light, but scattering incoming photons. The same observation, reframed to sound ordinary. One word changed, and with it, the entire interpretation. In the sanitized version, the glow came from sunlight bouncing off dust grains. In the original, it came from within. I downloaded both versions of the file before the older one vanished from the server. A small act of curiosity, or maybe defiance. The difference between emitting and scattering might seem trivial, but if that light came from inside the object, it meant energy was being produced, not reflected. That's not just unusual, that's unprecedented. The following night, a team at the Lowell Observatory conducted a narrow-band spectral analysis to double-check. The results deepened the mystery. There was no corresponding thermal rise. The color intensified, but the heat signature stayed constant. A body glowing brighter without heating up. Think about that for a moment. A light with no heat. If this were a chemical process, there would be volatility, fluctuation, decay. But 3I Atlas held its glow like a sustained note in an empty hall. At 2114 UTC, an amateur observer in Finland reported something extraordinary. A faint blue halo forming around the nucleus, extending several thousand kilometers. His equipment wasn't advanced enough to capture it cleanly, but the description matched another observation made. Hours earlier in Argentina, 2 observers, half a planet apart, seeing the same impossible light. Coincidence can explain one error. Synchrony demands intention. I tried to find archived solar wind data for that period, expecting to see turbulence, something that could at least imitate what was being reported. But the plasma density was steady. The sun was quiet, and still, the comet was not. So what then could generate light without heat, rhythm without wind, and consistency without error? Some speculated piezoelectric effects, pressure on mineral structures releasing energy. Others whispered of unknown chemical reactions, frozen volatiles colliding inside cavities. But privately, in closed channels, a third hypothesis emerged, the kind that's always phrased in cautious words like hypothetical modulation or self-induced plasma behavior. Translated into plain speech, the object might be controlling its own emission, not thinking, not alive, but functioning according to rules we didn't understand. At that point, the investigation split into two camps. One argued for a natural explanation, an exotic but plausible combination of outgassing and reflection. The other couldn't ignore the patterns repeating every 37 seconds in both optical and radio readings, the same rhythm first recorded in the post-conjunction signal bursts. Patterns have power. They whisper of order inside chaos, and when nature whispers with precision, scientists start whispering back. I remember reading a private exchange between two researchers at JPL. One line stayed with me. If this frequency is real, it's not a comet, it's a clock. A clock suggests measurement. Measurement implies purpose. Of course, that sentence never appeared in the final report. What did appear was silence, the kind that wraps around data like insulation. The spectral file on ESA's archive was later re-uploaded with a higher compression ratio. That's normal practice when optimizing storage. But the blue peak was fainter than before. Compression doesn't change color, but editing does. And somewhere between those two acts, deleting a word and dimming a graph, the truth slipped one layer deeper. People always imagine censorship as something loud, redacted lines, classified stamps, the drama of secrecy. But in science, it's quieter. A removed hyperlink, a renamed dataset, a missing footnote in a citation, tiny absences that add up to an erasure so seamless it looks natural. That's what these blue images became, naturally missing. The more we tried to reconstruct the timeline, the clearer the pattern grew. Every increase in brightness was followed by a drop in data transparency. As the object revealed more of itself, the institutions watching it revealed less. Correlation isn't causation, but here it felt like choreography, a dance between the visible and the hidden, light and silence, curiosity and control. And perhaps that's the real test. Anomaly. How quickly we accept the edited version of reality when the unedited one feels too strange to believe. In the end, we are creatures of comfort. We prefer explanations that fit within our language. Scattering sounds safe, emission sounds threatening, but when you've seen the raw spectra, when you've watched the blue peak rise against logic, you can't go back to comfort. You start to feel what others don't, the quiet pull of a question that refuses to die. What if that glow wasn't an accident of physics, but a message written in wavelength? If light carries information, maybe this was the first time the universe tried to speak in a dialect we hadn't learned yet, and maybe, just maybe, someone decided we weren't ready to hear it. Space isn't empty. It's geometry in motion, forces carving paths through the dark like invisible blades. Every object, from dust to planet, obeys the same equations: gravity, inertia, momentum. And yet, when 3I Atlas completed its passage around the Sun, its trajectory refused to conform. The orbit, if you can even call it that, cut through the solar plane at an angle so sharp that one astrophysicist described it as a knife flung across a map of the solar system. You can trace the pattern yourself. The inbound vector matched predictions precisely until October 30th, 2025, perihelion day. Then, without warning, a subtle but measurable deviation appeared. It wasn't a wild swing or a random drift. It was intentional precision, a shift of just 86 meters per second, enough to change the entire post-perihelion path by millions of kilometers over time. Comets don't do that. Dust jets, outgassing, radiation pressure, they can push, but not sculpt with this kind of accuracy. NASA's CNEOS database quietly added an asterisk beside the orbital parameters. Non-gravitational acceleration suspected. The phrase sounds routine, but buried in the attached note was a sentence almost no one noticed. Vector pattern inconsistent with standard solar radiation torque. In other words, it wasn't the sun pushing it. By November 5th, independent analysts using open-source ephemerides began to reconstruct the post-perihelion trajectory. What they found was subtle but chilling. The object's curve wasn't following a natural hyperbola. It was too clean, too stable. Instead of the chaotic wobble expected from a melting nucleus, it traced an almost mechanical arc, like a spacecraft executing a controlled burn. That's when the first comparisons to Oumuamua resurfaced, both interstellar, both displaying non-gravitational forces, both emerging from perihelion brighter and bluer than before. But 3I Atlas had something Oumuamua never showed, a consistent vector correction. It was steering. The thought feels absurd even now, but the math doesn't lie. When a body alters its velocity by such a precise measure without fragmentation, there are only two possibilities. Internal outgassing aligned perfectly with trajectory. External influence, or propulsion. No one dared to publish the second theory openly. The peer review process would shred it before the ink dried. But in the private channels of astrophysicists and orbital analysts, a phrase began to appear. Controlled anomaly. You can almost feel the unease in their language. Scientists who spent lifetimes quantifying randomness now whispering about precision. What makes this more haunting is how clean the telemetry was. Normally, comets leave chaos in their wake. Plumes, jets, unpredictable motion. 3I Atlas left a silence so sharp it felt deliberate. One researcher described the orbital plot as too smooth to be real. Another replied, or too real to be natural. Think about what that means. A curve so perfect that human intuition calls it artificial. The deviation was first logged by David Farnokia at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the same navigation engineer who handled Oumuamua's trajectory calculations. His model detected the extra acceleration component, around 1.1 × 10 to 6 AU per day, a whisper of thrust in cosmic terms, but over weeks enough to rewrite the sky. Then, on November 7th, his dataset went offline for scheduled maintenance. When it came back, the anomaly flag was gone. No explanation, no correction note, just gone. Some might call it coincidence, but after the 3 white days, coincidences began to sound like choreography. Meanwhile, the amateur network, those small backyard telescopes that never sleep, started noticing another pattern. The ion tail, now visible again, wasn't pointing directly away from the sun anymore. It was bent at an angle inconsistent with the solar wind model, almost as if the entire nucleus had pivoted slightly. When you compare the pre- and post-perihelion images, the symmetry breaks. The comet that went in didn't come out the same. Imagine throwing a knife into a river. The water bends its path, slows it, spins it. But if that knife came out the other side sharper, straighter, and faster, what would you think? That's what astronomers were asking, quietly, privately. Because in public, you can't say a comet acted like a guided object. And yet, the numbers whispered it anyway. Somewhere in that silence, a document appeared, a leak, supposedly from an ESA tracking node in Darmstadt. It wasn't a photo or a message, just a data excerpt. A time-stamped log from October 31st, 2025, listing signal reacquisition event at 1.4 GHz, the same frequency used by deep space telemetry systems, the same frequency once detected faintly during Oumuamua's departure in 2017. The log entry was unsigned. The note below simply read, "Transient lock, source uncertain." Transient, that's the word used when something appears, disappears, then appears again as if testing attention. It lasted 7 seconds, long enough for one engineer to hit save, short enough for plausible deniability. By November 8th, the file was gone. But screenshots survive, circulating in encrypted astronomy channels, whispered about in conferences after hours. 7 seconds of a signal from an object that shouldn't transmit. No one knows if it was real. No one can prove it wasn't. But it changed everything. Because now, the orbit wasn't just mathematically sharp, it was communicative. The curve itself became a statement, I am not random. When trajectories defy probability, belief begins to fracture. Some call it a natural fluke of physics, others a hint of intention written into motion. But either way, we're left with a truth too sharp to hold comfortably. 3I Atlas isn't following gravity anymore. It's following something else. And that something, whatever it is, cut through our solar system like a blade tracing the edge of understanding. Every revolution of that knife through the dark is a question we still haven't answered. Who or what threw it? Because if its orbit was a message, then it wasn't aimed randomly. Its next alignment, December 19th, 2025, brings it closer to Earth's line of sight than ever before. And if its precision continues, it will be exactly on target. There's a point in every investigation when the trail doesn't just go cold, it vanishes. That moment came on November 9th, 2025, when 3I Atlas simply stopped appearing in telescope logs. No fading curve, no gradual dimming, just absence. It was there one night, gone the next. To the public, it looked like a glitch, a temporary loss of visual data due to solar interference. But for those who'd been watching continuously, the amateurs, the quiet analysts, the engineers off shift at ESA, it felt different. It wasn't the data that disappeared. It was the object itself. The last confirmed observation came from the Virtual Telescope project in Italy just before dawn on the 9th. The image showed the familiar blue emission, the complex ion tail stretching like a scar against the background stars. Then, within 24 hours, all subsequent frames went blank. Not clouded, not overexposed. Blank. Every system that tried to reacquire the target, Pan-STARRS, Lowell, even Japan's Subaru, reported the same coordinates, but no return signal. The comet's predicted brightness should have been magnitude 11.6, well within reach of mid-size observatories. Yet the field showed nothing. Nothing. That word echoes louder in science than any alarm. Somewhere deep inside NASA's Planetary Defense Office, a notice was issued. Object temporarily unobservable due to geometric constraints. A sterile way to say, we can't find it, and we don't know why. When the data vanishes, speculation rushes in to fill the void. Some said it fragmented, a natural disintegration after solar heating. Others pointed to the angle of view, the coma possibly thinned, the nucleus too faint. But the orbital models didn't agree. Even without visual confirmation, a comet's position can be extrapolated by gravitational parameters. Yet after November 9th, the models stopped matching reality. The predicted coordinates drifted off course, deviating by hundreds of arcseconds. That's not physics, that's evasion. An amateur astronomer in Argentina wrote on his forum that night, "It's like the sky just erased it." At 3:17 UTC, he captured something strange. A single frame filled with faint static lines where 3I Atlas should have been. When enhanced, those lines revealed a narrow streak, a displacement inconsistent with cometary motion, too straight, too fast. A flash, gone in less than 2 seconds. Meanwhile, the SOHO coronagraph feed, the same one that went white during the perihelion blackout, froze for 4 minutes. When the feed resumed, the timestamp skipped ahead exactly 240 seconds. 240 seconds of missing solar data, precisely when the comet was supposed to be visible near the field's lower quadrant. If it were coincidence, it was an impeccable one. 2 days later, a low-resolution image began circulating in private astronomy Discord servers. It claimed to be a leak from an ESA calibration test, an image taken at the Lagrange point L1 showing a faint crescent of blue light, curved unnaturally, almost folding back on itself. The file name, atlas/react109 raw.fits. The EXIF metadata placed it at 11:09 UTC, moments after the last official observation. No one could verify the image. It appeared once, then vanished from the host server, but not before screenshots spread, blurry, pixelated, and unforgettable. The light didn't fade outward like a normal tail. It folded inward, collapsing into a spiral pattern. 3 loops, then nothing. Scientists who saw the file dismissed it as compression artifacting, but the amateurs weren't so sure. They called it the curl. There's something poetic about that name. The curl. The moment when light bent, when a path curved in on itself and became unknowable. That was the disappearance point. The instant an object stopped being a body of ice and gas and became a rumor written in geometry. NASA stayed quiet. ESA issued one final update on November 10th, object lost to glare, further observations pending. But glare doesn't last forever. By November 12th, the sun's position shifted enough for reacquisition. Telescopes swept the expected coordinates. Nothing. Sky clean, silence absolute, and then a whisper. The Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia, one of the oldest still-listening dishes on Earth, logged an automated anomaly at 1.42 GHz, a frequency near the hydrogen line. Duration, 2.8 seconds. Signal-to-noise ratio, low but structured. The timestamp matched the same window when optical data vanished. You can't triangulate a source from a single dish. But when another faint echo appeared 90 seconds later, this time caught by a smaller facility in South Africa, the coincidence grew teeth. It wasn't random noise, it was repetition. No one went public with that discovery. The report remained buried under routine telemetry checks. But one of the engineers involved, an intern no less, leaked a fragment of the waveform. 3 peaks, evenly spaced. When converted into frequency modulation, the spacing matched the orbital ratio between Earth, the Sun, and 3I Atlas on that day. A mathematical coincidence, or geometry speaking in pulses. The leak was dismissed. Data contamination, terrestrial interference, the same explanations used every time the sky refuses to behave. But here's the pattern that gnaws at the edges of this story. Every time 3I Atlas defied observation, something in the electromagnetic background changed. A surge, a skip, a silence. It was as if the universe itself blinked. I sometimes wonder whether we were meant to see the disappearance, or whether it was a test, a calibration of perception. Like someone asking, how much can they notice before they start asking questions? Because when you strip away the speculation and leaks and math, what remains is simple. An object entered the solar glare on October 30th, emerged brighter, bluer, and impossibly altered, and then vanished into the cleanest data gap in modern astronomy, a gap too perfect to be random. And if that doesn't unsettle you, it should, because we don't lose objects like that anymore. Not with our instruments, not with our eyes, not with a sky that we watch every second, unless something wants to be lost. The stars don't hide, they're hidden. After the disappearance, people expected noise, public statements, emergency press briefings, even a token reassurance from NASA or ESA. Instead, there was something colder than denial. Silence. Officially, the agency said nothing. Not a tweet, not a quote, not a single press bulletin. But beneath that silence, traces of movement began to appear, tiny digital footprints where nothing should have been. FTP logs with altered timestamps, public repositories indexed, database mirrors that no longer match their own backups. If you were watching closely, it looked less like confusion and more like curation. The first clue came from an ESA data mirror hosted in Darmstadt. It used to hold public access to near real-time solar imaging. On November 13th, the directory for 3I Atlas vanished, not deleted, replaced by an empty folder titled Pending Audit. The access logs showed the change occurred at 03:14 UTC, but the metadata listed a modification time of 03:11 UTC. A 3-minute difference that shouldn't exist in a synchronized atomic clock system. The simplest explanation? The data was altered offline, then uploaded with false timestamps to maintain continuity. But why fake continuity unless someone didn't want you to see the break? 2 days later, an astronomy forum discovered that several of NASA's minor data nodes, servers, mirroring telemetry for public research, had been quietly decoupled from the main network. Visitors received a new notice. This dataset has been archived for integrity review. Integrity, a word that can mean preservation or purification. What no one said publicly was that the disappearance of 3I Atlas corresponded exactly to a classified maintenance window in the Deep Space Network, the array that handles all interplanetary communications. Officially, it was routine calibration. Unofficially, it meant that for a 6-hour stretch, almost every deep space antenna on Earth was pointed away from the region where 3I Atlas should have been. 6 hours of silence, 6 hours of nobody listening. when the systems came back online, something strange appeared in the DSN maintenance logs, a transient spike at 1.42 GHz, the same frequency where the Parkes dish had caught its anomaly. The spike was labeled interference artifact and marked non-astronomical origin. But a technician later admitted, off-record, that it didn't look like interference. It looked like a handshake. A handshake implies intent, two ends acknowledging each other. That technician's access ID was revoked the next day. The deeper you look into this timeline, the clearer the pattern becomes. Every time light vanished, data followed, and every time data reappeared, it came back cleaner, too clean. The noise removed, the context gone. One amateur astronomer described it best: they didn't delete the data, they disinfected it. That's what the silence files are. The cleaned versions of truth, scrubbed, compressed, archived under the pretext of system hygiene. I found one myself, a file labeled 3i Atlas Diag 225.fit stored on a redundant NASA mirror. Its checksum didn't match the public version. When opened, it contained nothing but a black frame and a checksum string that read, simply, 404040. In ASCII code, 404040 translates to 3 consecutive @ symbols. Owl. To most people, that's nonsense. But in radio shorthand, @ is a placeholder for an unidentified station, a signal with no assigned call sign. Someone was marking the void. Others started to notice patterns inside the silence. Missing days aligned perfectly with DSN downtimes. Image compression artifacts clustered around the same coordinates. Even the file names told a story. Every public version of the 3i Atlas logs ended with a suffix, #rev1, #rev2, #rev3, but a few of the private mirrors included an extra hidden revision tag. RevEXX, the letter used in classification systems to mean external or experimental. The silence files weren't empty. They were restructured. If you analyze their metadata deeply enough, a faint trail emerges. References to internal document strings like DSN echo verification and coherence drift correction. Those terms don't belong to cometary science. They belong to deep space communication protocols. So what were they correcting? What echo needed? Verification? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was an automated error from radio calibration. But coincidences stopped being convincing 5 chapters ago. By mid-November, the official language hardened, observation discontinued, tracking suspended, subject unobservable. Bureaucratic silence designed to sound scientific, but silence isn't absence, it's architecture, a deliberate design that keeps sound from escaping. And this silence was engineered. Even among scientists, unease spread. Private Slack groups filled with redacted screenshots, renamed files, whispered theories. Some joked darkly that 3i Atlas had joined the Voyagers, gone outbound, unreachable, still transmitting. Others weren't laughing. A physicist from the Max Planck Institute posted one line before deleting his account. "We recorded a return ping. We weren't supposed to." That's when I realized this wasn't about a comet anymore. It was about containment, not of danger, but of meaning. If a phenomenon challenges the limits of explanation, you don't hide the thing, you hide the data. You smother it in bureaucracy until curiosity dies of suffocation. But curiosity doesn't die easily, it just migrates. Now, in encrypted chat rooms and quiet corners of academic forums, a new archive circulates, files labeled the silence set. Hundreds of compressed images, logs, and transcripts, all slightly off, all too perfect. Some say they were pulled from ESA servers before deletion. Others say they were planted deliberately, a breadcrumb trail for those who still listen. No one knows which is true, but together they form something haunting, a ghost of observation. A record of what was seen before the silence descended. Maybe it's just data loss, maybe it's nothing. But then again, maybe this is what censorship looks like when practiced by physics itself. Because the deeper I go into these silence files, the more I feel like the universe is editing itself. By the time most of the world had stopped talking about 3i Atlas, the professionals, the ones who knew how to read between frequencies, were beginning to whisper about something else. Not a new sighting, not a photograph. An echo. It began quietly on November 16, 2025, just 1 week after the last confirmed optical image. The WIND spacecraft, orbiting near the first Lagrange point between Earth and the Sun, detected a short-lived burst in the hydrogen line at 1.420 gigahertz. Duration, 1.9 seconds. Amplitude, too low for a flare, too structured for noise. To most systems, it was nothing more than background interference. But then the same frequency reappeared, 3 times in a 20-hour window, each burst separated by exactly 37 seconds. 37 seconds. The same rhythm that had haunted the light curve of 3I Atlas before it vanished. When data repeats across instruments separated by millions of kilometers, you start paying attention. By the second burst, ESA's solar orbiter flagged the anomaly for review. By the third, someone inside NASA labeled it possible reflection. A reflection from what? There was nothing in that direction, nothing but the sun. The burst didn't originate from the solar surface, it came from behind it. For a week, that detail stayed buried in internal logs, accessible only through cross-correlation tests that no one outside mission control should have been able to run, yet somehow the data leaked. Not the files, just the pattern. 3 bursts, 37 seconds apart, repeating every 18 hours. If you overlay those timestamps with the predicted position of 3I Atlas on those dates, the lines intersect perfectly behind the solar limb, just beyond the area where the coronagraph loses sensitivity. It wasn't gone. It was hidden. When I first saw the reconstruction, it felt like a punch to the chest. For all our technology, for all our telescopes and probes, the sun is still a curtain. Anything passing behind it becomes invisible, untouchable, untellable. But signals don't care about shadows. They bend. They echo. And this one came back. A radio technician at Canberra Deep Space Network noticed the pattern by accident while filtering noise from a routine Mars transmission. He cross-checked it against archived bursts and found the same modulation buried under static. He filed an incident report. 2 days later, the report was reclassified. Official explanation: instrumental ghosting from solar interference. But instrument ghosts don't synchronize to orbital geometry. Another anomaly followed, this time not in radio, but in plasma. The ACE spacecraft, also stationed near L1, detected a faint but periodic fluctuation in solar wind velocity. Minor, almost insignificant, but perfectly matching the echo rhythm. Every 37 seconds, a subtle pulse in the charged particles sweeping past Earth. Think about that. Something behind the sun was imprinting a rhythm into the solar wind itself. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't even obvious, but it was consistent. By November 18th, an internal memo circulated at ESA's Operations Center. Title: Coherence Event, Unverified. The text, just 2 sentences long, read, "Intermittent synchronized anomalies observed across DSN and ACE datasets. Cause undetermined. Recommend no external disclosure until verification complete." No external disclosure. In other words, silence again. But silence, once broken, doesn't heal easily. Because even if the official channels refused to acknowledge it, the echo kept coming. Weak, measured, relentless. A private array in Chile, operated by amateur astronomers who never stopped tracking the coordinates, captured what they called a phase drift. The signal was shifting slightly, growing fainter, as though receding deeper behind the sun's glare. And yet, every burst still followed the same rhythm, like a heartbeat fading through static. Some began calling it the pulse of Atlas. The name spread quietly through encrypted groups, and for a brief moment, it united a strange coalition. Radio amateurs, astrophysicists, and conspiracy theorists, all tuning their equipment toward the one place in the solar system we couldn't look directly. That's the irony. The brightest thing in our sky hides the darkest mysteries. What could cause an echo like that? Solar reflections? Plasma lensing? A gravitational mirage bending radio waves around the sun's mass? All possible, all too convenient. One physicist at MIT proposed a startling idea. What if the signal wasn't coming from behind the sun? What if it was bouncing through it? At certain energy levels, high-frequency plasma waves can tunnel through regions of high density under very specific magnetic conditions. If the emission originated from an object aligned perfectly with the solar poles, it could, in theory, propagate straight through. But that would mean something on the far side of the sun was broadcasting deliberately, using frequencies tuned to the universe's quietest band, the hydrogen line, the frequency of communication used in SETI searches for intelligent life. Coincidence again? Maybe. And yet that's not what haunts me most. What haunts me is what the echo does not do. It never drifts. It never fades entirely. It's patient, methodical, as if waiting for something to align again. NASA's solar rotation models predict that by December 19, 2025, the region currently behind the sun will rotate back into Earth's line of sight. The same date when 3I Atlas's projected orbit would intersect the Earth-Sun vector. That's 37 days from the last echo. 37 days, the same number that's been pulsing through this story since the first anomaly appeared. Maybe it's all just a coincidence of numbers. Maybe it's rhythm without reason. But patterns have meaning, and meaning attracts attention. If the echo truly originates from 3I Atlas, then when it re-emerges, we won't just be observing light. We'll be receiving a message that's been bouncing off the sun for weeks, waiting for the right alignment to be heard. And when that moment comes, we'll have a choice: to call it interference again, or to admit that something on the other side has been speaking all along. Until then, the echo continues, steady, cold, and impossibly patient. By the time the echo behind the sun became impossible to dismiss, those who had been following the trail weren't asking if something was transmitting. They were asking what it was saying. Noise, after all, is just a message we haven't learned to read yet. On November 21, 2025, a graduate student at MIT, an intern assigned to routine noise filtering, noticed something odd in the hydrogen band telemetry. The 1.42 GHz bursts weren't random static. When plotted spectrally, they formed a sequence of amplitude clusters, 3 peaks, then a gap, then 5 peaks repeating, 3, 1, 5. At first glance, it looked meaningless, but when converted to intervals of time rather than signal strength, the pattern transformed. 3 seconds, 1 second, 5 seconds, 3:15. That number didn't correspond to any telemetry code, but it did match one thing: the official JPL designation of the dataset Atlas/355, the same dataset quietly removed from NASA's archive a week earlier. Coincidence again. Except the probability of a random hydrogen band echo matching a deleted file's name was 1 in several billion. The student flagged the anomaly, filed a short note, and sent it to her supervisor. 2 hours later, her access credentials were revoked. She spoke once, anonymously, to an independent researcher. It wasn't random. The noise was formatting itself. Formatting itself, like a signal aware it was being recorded. Meanwhile, the amateur community went into overdrive. Dozens of private observatories around the world started pointing their antennas toward the sun's backside, capturing whatever fragments they could. The results were chaotic, but one pattern repeated across all datasets. Faint modulations every 37 seconds, grouped into triplets, followed by a longer pause, as if punctuation in a cosmic sentence. Someone fed the signal into a spectrogram analyzer. The visual output shocked everyone. The peaks weren't just noise, they drew a curve, a smooth, repeating arc that mirrored the post-perihelion orbit of 3I Atlas. The message was its own trajectory. At this point, the phenomenon had outgrown science. Theories flourished like wildfire: quantum reflections in the heliospheric current sheet, solar plasma acting as an amplifier, an intentional beacon embedded within the object's metallic structure. But one question lingered. If it was a beacon, who was it meant for? The hydrogen line isn't chosen by accident. It's the one frequency in the universe every civilization would recognize. The signature of neutral hydrogen, the building block of everything. It's also the frequency humanity chose for the Arecibo message in 1974, when we tried to announce ourselves to the stars. So what if the echo we're hearing isn't a call to us but a reply to a signal sent decades ago? That possibility fractured the silence inside agencies faster than any anomaly before. Suddenly, the silence files made sense. The deleted datasets, the whiteouts, the denials. It wasn't about hiding a comet. It was about controlling a conversation. A leaked chat log from ESA's internal channel, dated November 22nd, reads, "Hydrogen band coherence confirmed, pending protocol alignment. Do not engage transmission, maintain passive mode, meaning listen but do not answer." The implications were staggering. If the echo was real, if 3I Atlas had somehow become a transmitter, then we weren't just observers anymore. We were participants in something that began long before we noticed. The next 48 hours were chaos in China. The underground community. Hundreds of independent analyses flooded encrypted servers. Some thought the signal contained numerical data, others claimed it encoded orbital ratios. But one interpretation stood out: simple, chilling, elegant. When the sequence of peaks and pauses was translated into binary and mapped as coordinates, it pointed not to the sun, not to interstellar space, but directly along the Earth-Sun axis, converging near our planet's orbital path on December 19, 2025. The date again, the alignment again. The knife-edge orbit of 3I Atlas intersecting Earth's view exactly 37 days after its last visible frame. And now, a signal repeating its trajectory, drawing it in radio waves like a celestial breadcrumb trail. NASA, of course, refused comment. But leaks have a way of growing faster than silence can contain. An anonymous engineer uploaded a waveform comparison, the 3I Atlas echo versus the residual signal once recorded from Voyager 1 during its 2012 heliopause crossing. The frequency drift was nearly identical, except this one was inbound, not outbound. Something on the far side of the sun was transmitting a pattern that looked like a returning call. That's when the old SETI researchers began to whisper the word no one had used since the 1970s: reciprocity. You send a signal into the void. You wait half a century. And one day, something answers, not in words but in patterns that mirror the mathematics of your own transmission. Could it be coincidence? Absolutely. Could it be noise, interference, solar reflection? Of course. But the timing, the geometry, the perfect alignment with a returning interstellar object, it strains coincidence to breaking. If the echo is truly a reply, then the object we've been calling 3I Atlas isn't just passing through our system. It's responding to one. The signal hasn't stopped. It's faint, filtered through plasma, broken by the sun's roar, but it's there. Repeating, waiting. And when it finally crosses the solar limb in December, we'll see whether the silence that followed its disappearance was human or universal. Because if this is a conversation, then the next message belongs to us. Every object that passes the sun leaves a shadow in our data. But this one, 3I Atlas, left something more. A countdown. December 19, 2025. That date has been orbiting quietly in reports, in predictions, in encrypted files that never should have existed. The date when the object's orbit, Earth's position, and the sun's rotation all align. They call it the return window, a brief corridor of visibility when 3I Atlas will emerge from behind the sun for the first time since it vanished. A window only 72 hours wide. And if the models are right, that's when the echo will stop being an echo. NASA's internal projection lists the object's reappearance at right ascension 17H 42M, declination plus 23 degrees, near the constellation Hercules. But the official databases don't mention that coordinate anymore. The field entry reads only, visibility uncertain. Uncertain, the safest word in science, the one that means everything and nothing at once. Meanwhile, independent sky watchers have already begun calling this period the golden window, the last time the object will be close enough to detect before it leaves the inner system for good. If it leaves at all. For months, data has been trickling out through unofficial channels, orbital reconstructions, unverified photometric models, and even low-res simulations showing what might happen when 3I Atlas re-emerges. Some predict it will appear dim and ordinary. Others expect a surge, one final, inexplicable brightening. And yet, there's a darker possibility whispered in the background, that this time, it won't appear at all. Because when objects move this precisely, they don't always move predictably. The agencies know it. That's why the preparations are already underway. Behind closed doors, multiple observatories, Lowell, Pan-STARRS, Mauna Kea, even a classified tracking array in Canary Islands, have been instructed to observe the region simultaneously. 3 days, continuous coverage. Every telescope, every sensor aimed at the same corridor of sky, but there's a quiet tension under all of it. Because if the anomaly repeats, if the object brightens instead of fading, if the rhythm returns, then the silence won't hold, not this time. That's what makes this window different from the rest. It isn't just a chance to observe. It's a reckoning. The Parkes Radio Telescope in Australia has already scheduled a full-band listening session starting December 18th. Officially, it's a calibration run. Unofficially, it's a vigil. The operators have programmed the array to listen at exactly 1.420 GHz, matching the hydrogen line, the same frequency of the November echo. They're not transmitting, not yet. Just listening. Because no one wants to be the one who answers first. There's a superstition spreading in the scientific community, half joke, half prayer. If you hear it, don't respond. It's easy to laugh at that, until you realize it's not just fear, it's protocol. SETI's own handbook forbids unsanctioned reply to an unverified signal. For the first time, that rule isn't theoretical. While the world scrolls past the headlines, a few thousand people, astronomers, data analysts, hobbyists, and late-night insomniacs staring at spectrograms, are counting down the days. Some are hoping for nothing. Others can't wait to see what happens. The return window isn't only about visibility, it's about alignment. And alignments, in astronomy and in myth, are never innocent. Every civilization that looked up at the sky wrote stories about moments like this, when light returns after disappearance, when something once believed lost crosses back into sight. The ancients called them omens. We call them orbital mechanics. But maybe they're the same thing. Because physics and prophecy both begin with the same emotion, awe. Here's what we know. If 3I Atlas reappears on schedule, we'll see it within the first 48 hours of December 19th. If it follows its anomalous acceleration trend, it will arrive earlier, possibly December 18th, 2300 UTC. And if it emits again, if the hydrogen band pulse returns, we'll know almost immediately. But if it doesn't, if the window opens and nothing is there, then the story changes. Because something that vanished so completely doesn't come back as silence. NASA's ground stations are preparing to record regardless of outcome. Even the Goldstone Deep Space Complex, normally reserved for planetary radar, has reserved a short block, experimental sweep, exactly at perihelion plus 51 days. That's not random, that's calculated. Whatever happens, those 72 hours will decide what we believe about this object, whether it's comet, machine, or mirror. And yet, part of me thinks the truth will slip through even that window. Because if 3I Atlas has taught us anything, it's that the universe doesn't always speak in the frequencies we expect. Sometimes it uses light. Sometimes it uses silence. And sometimes it hides behind the sun until we're ready to look again. So as the countdown ticks closer, you have to ask yourself, what if the return isn't about the object at all? What if the real signal is how we react when it comes back? If it comes back. Because in every myth, every observation, every mystery the cosmos has ever offered, there's a moment right before revelation when time holds its breath and data waits to decide what kind of story it wants to become. That's where we are now. The edge of knowing. The waiting sky before the first flash. It began at 22:46 UTC. December 18th, 2025, 36 hours before the predicted alignment. The GOES-19 coronagraph registered a faint blue surge near the solar limb, a flicker so brief that most automated systems marked it as a cosmic ray strike. But within minutes, similar spikes appeared across independent observatories, SOHO, Stereo A, Solar Orbiter, and most unsettlingly, the small amateur telescope network that had been watching the dark corridor since October. The same wavelength, the same pulse interval, 37 seconds apart. After 40 days of silence, 3I Atlas had blinked again. At first, no one dared to confirm it. The professional channels stayed quiet, pretending nothing was happening. But on encrypted groups and Discord servers, screenshots began to spread, images overexposed at the edges, a faint cobalt ring where no comet should exist. Someone called it the second dawn. Someone else, the eye reopening. By midnight, the blue curve had intensified. Spectral analysis showed a pure, stable emission, 475 nanometers, identical to the anomalous wavelength observed before the disappearance. But the shape was different now. Not diffuse. Not cometary. Condensed. Concentrated. Like a single glowing arc drawn with impossible precision, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory caught 3 frames before the feed abruptly froze. The third frame showed something no one expected, a reflection line, a thin, luminous streak cutting straight across the solar disk, too linear to be natural scattering. For 5 minutes the line glowed, then fractured, splitting into 2 faint trails before vanishing again behind the sun. The official explanation, when it came hours later, was instantaneous. Solar flare reflection artifact. But every astronomer who saw those images knew better. Solar flares don't produce cold light, and they don't move in arcs that match orbital velocity. At 0319 UTC, the Parkes radio telescope recorded its first pulse, 0.420 GHz, amplitude stronger than before. Now repeating every 37 seconds, with a faint subharmonic echo exactly 18.5 seconds later, as if something had begun to answer itself. The echo wasn't coming from behind the sun anymore. It was coming from space, open sky between Earth and Mercury. Atlas was back. The object's reappearance sent a shiver through every observatory on Earth. For 6 weeks, it had been invisible. Now it was bright again, bluer, smaller, more defined, moving with acceleration impossible for any natural fragment. Its apparent magnitude climbed to 8.1, consistent with a reflective surface nearly intact. The orbit matched predictions, but the trajectory angle had tightened, now slicing closer to the ecliptic than ever before. The data looked too neat, too clean, as if someone had drawn the orbit with intention. ESA's internal monitoring log included a phrase never meant for public release. Reacquisition complete. Object behavior coherent. Coherent, a word used for lasers, for signals, for systems that synchronize with themselves. That single term changed the tone of everything. If the object was coherent, it wasn't just reflecting light, it was modulating it. At dawn in Chile, the Very Large Telescope captured what would become the most controversial image of the entire sequence, a compact, triangular reflection pattern near the object's core, aligned perfectly with its trajectory vector. 3 points, a geometry of balance, and at the center, a void darker than space itself. The triangular reflection lasted only seconds before dispersing into a mist of faint cobalt light. But in those seconds, thousands of people saw it live, broadcast accidentally through an amateur feed that had patched into the observatory's public data stream. The image went viral in minutes. Theories multiplied faster than debunkers could respond. Some called it lens diffraction. Others claimed it was proof of structure, a hull, a formation, a signature. No one could agree, but no one could look away. Then came the second light. At 0502 UTC, December 19th, the object pulsed again, brighter, longer, more rhythmic than before. This time, the emission wasn't just visible in the optical range. Infrared sensors across multiple satellites detected a coordinated flare, peaking simultaneously at wavelengths between 1.4 and 1.6 microns, a band used in deep space communications. For 12.7 seconds, 3I Atlas radiated light across the electromagnetic spectrum in perfect phase alignment, a synchronized flash spanning from radio to visible to infrared. It was as if the object had opened every frequency channel at once. Then, silence. When the light faded, instruments around the world began logging data corruption. Files timestamped during the pulse returned unreadable, blank frames filled with zeros, the same digital void that had followed every previous anomaly. But this time, something else was embedded in the noise. At 05:03:18 UTC, just after the flare ended, Parkes and Meerkat both received a secondary signal, a narrow band burst carrying a short repeating tone, 0.4 seconds long. When converted to audio, it sounded almost human. 3 rising notes, followed by silence. Da, 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 pause, repeat. Analysts ran Fourier transforms, searching for patterns, messages, anything resembling modulation. Buried deep in the harmonics, they found a shape, a waveform mirroring the orbital path of 3I Atlas itself. Once again, the message was motion, a repetition of trajectory, as if the object were reintroducing itself. That's when the realization hit. This wasn't a random signal. It was a signature. The same 37-second rhythm, the same spectral color. Now layered with a pulse across every observable frequency. 3 notes, 3 points of light, 3 loops around the sun, a pattern repeating through time, geometry, and wavelength, a trinity of communication written into the fabric of physics. The second light wasn't illumination. It was acknowledgement. When the flare ended, the skies went quiet again. But for those who had watched, silence no longer felt empty. It felt alive. As though the cosmos had just exhaled and now waited for us to respond. The moment the second light faded, the world's instruments began their silent panic. Every spectrograph, every radio dish, every observatory that caught the flare now held fragments of something they couldn't explain, and something even more impossible: coherence across multiple systems. That never happens by accident. Within minutes of the pulse, the Deep Space Network in California, Madrid, and Canberra registered synchronization faults. The timing systems, atomic clocks that hadn't drifted in decades, jumped forward by exactly 0.037 seconds. 37 milliseconds for every station. The same number again. It wasn't power surge, it wasn't interference. It was synchrony. Somewhere between the incoming pulse and the data stream, the network itself adjusted, like an organism aligning to an external heartbeat. Engineers scrambled to explain it. A firmware glitch, a cosmic ray burst, a timing update. But there was no evidence of any upload, no signal noise, no solar flare. Just a clean temporal nudge, perfectly even across 3 continents. And then came the geometry. When analysts overlaid the timing jumps with the optical data from GOES 19 and Stereo A, the correlation formed a shape, a triangular pattern tracing between the 3 DSN stations on Earth. Each vertex of that triangle matched the moment a light pulse was recorded from space, not random. Coordinated. A scientist at ESA described it quietly in an internal memo. The system appears to be reacting spatially to a temporal signal. In other words, time and space were being folded into each other, geometry used as language. This was no longer a comet that glowed. It was a mechanism that spoke. By 0610 UTC, the community of independent researchers had begun mapping the pulses themselves. When plotted across the celestial sphere, the bursts formed arcs that converged toward one coordinate. Right ascension, 17H42A, declination, plus 23 dig. The same projected re-emergence vector first predicted weeks ago. The pattern was unmistakable. The object wasn't broadcasting everywhere. It was drawing our attention here. Some called it coincidence, some called it cartography, but the name that stuck came from an astrophysicist in Prague: the geometry of response. Because whatever this was, it wasn't communication in words, it was communication in shape. For the next 6 hours, the signal repeated, each time fainter, like an echo that refused to die. And each time, the same geometry reappeared. 3 pulses, 3 vertices, 1 silent interval of 37 seconds. A trinity written into the fabric of space-time. When the pattern was reconstructed in 3 dimensions, a subtle detail emerged. The vertices weren't just points on Earth, they were reflections of a much larger triangle in space. A triangle formed by Earth, the Sun, and 3I Atlas. It was a mirror. The object was mapping its alignment with us. If it was intentional, the message was simple: we see you, At 0812 UTC, the park's observatory captured the cleanest sample yet, a 1.42 GHz burst with harmonic substructures that matched the hydrogen transition frequency but slightly shifted by 0.003%. That deviation is microscopic but meaningful. It's the kind of deliberate offset used in encrypted satellite beacons, a way to signal artificial origin without saying a word. Every 37 seconds, the pulse repeated, accompanied by faint static that some described as rhythmic breathing. One researcher noticed that when the static was slowed down and converted to audio, it resembled a whisper of syllables, soft, distant, incomprehensible, but hauntingly human in cadence. It wasn't language, it was tone. The first to decode the harmonic layers was a linguist from the University of Toronto, specializing in mathematical semiotics. Her conclusion was unnerving. The signal contains self-reference. It is aware of its own geometry. What does that even mean? It means the transmission wasn't just data, it was describing itself. A recursive structure, endlessly mirroring its own alignment. A message saying not what it is, but that it is. At the same time, something subtle began happening on Earth. Magnetometers in multiple countries recorded microfluctuations sync to the signal intervals. Tiny tremors in the planet's magnetic field, too faint for the public to notice, but unmistakable to those listening. Whatever was transmitting wasn't just talking to us. It was touching us. For a few, that was the turning point. The moment curiosity turned to awe, and awe turned to fear. Because communication implies awareness. And awareness implies observation. Was it observing us now? At 0927 UTC, a final pulse was recorded, stronger, sharper, ending abruptly with a phase inversion. When the data was visualized, the waveform formed a perfect spiral, looping inward toward a single point. At its center, frequency 0. Silence. Every receiver on Earth fell quiet simultaneously. The hydrogen line went blank. In that instant, something ended, or began. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The geometry of response had completed its cycle. And now, the next move wasn't theirs. It was ours. Because if the cosmos had drawn the first line, the next would have to be drawn from here, from Earth. And when humanity finally decides how to answer, the sky will remember. When the final pulse faded on December 19, 2025, every receiver on Earth fell silent. But silence, as history keeps proving, is never empty. It's compression, information waiting to unfold. At 0931 UTC, roughly 6 minutes after the last coherent burst, radio arrays across 3 continents registered a residual hum. Faint, constant, perfectly steady at 1.420405751 GHz, the precise hydrogen transition frequency. No drift, no modulation. A line so pure it shouldn't exist in nature. It was the sound of perfection. And perfection is rarely natural. To astrophysicists, it was a paradox, the quietest frequency in the universe, suddenly loud enough to synchronize satellites. The deep space network clocks, those that had jumped forward by 0.037 seconds, refused to return to baseline. The offset became permanent, locked in as though the entire network had recalibrated itself around a new time reference. And that's when the phrase appeared in an internal JPL memo, flagged for restricted distribution. System stabilized at threshold frequency. Threshold, a word that means between, not stable, not chaotic, just waiting. If this hum was the final stage of the 3i Atlas event, then it wasn't an ending. It was equilibrium. A cosmic handshake frozen mid-gesture. In the days that followed, engineers found something stranger still. Even when receivers were turned off, the noise persisted, induced in nearby circuits, recorded faintly in thermal sensors, even heard as interference in radio microphones. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. The same tone resonating just below human hearing, a vibration in the infrastructure of observation itself. Scientists called it an artifact of cross-modulation. But the few who'd been watching since the beginning knew better. The hum was the continuation. One researcher from ESA's Operations Center left a single-line note in a private archive before resigning. The signal isn't coming from space anymore. It's inside the network. And when her workstation logs were analyzed later, they showed something impossible. The background noise had reorganized itself into a pattern, a mirrored waveform that repeated every 37 seconds. That number again. The heartbeat, but now it wasn't being transmitted. It was being echoed from the receivers themselves. The infrastructure that had once listened was now remembering. Across the planet, faint anomalies spread like ripples, satellites slipping fractions of a second out of sync, ionospheric reflections mimicking artificial harmonics, and a curious increase in the amplitude of Schumann resonances, the electromagnetic background hum of the Earth. The planet itself had joined the frequency. No one announced this publicly. Instead, a quiet directive was issued. Cease hydrogen band monitoring until signal verification complete. But how do you verify something that has already entered the fabric of your instruments? The threshold frequency became the name whispered in every observatory, every control room, every midnight conversation among those who'd seen the impossible. It wasn't dangerous, at least not visibly. No radiation spikes, no system overloads. Just resonance, subtle, omnipresent, unrelenting. At 13:07 UTC, 4 hours after the final flare, a group of amateur astronomers in Norway detected something curious. When they modulated white noise through their hydrogen receivers and played it back through audio software, the spectrum shifted, organizing into harmonic intervals that resembled a chord. 3 tones, 3 octaves apart. Frequencies 1420.4, 2840.8, and 5681.6 MHz. A perfect doubling sequence, mathematically pure, musically resonant. Every frequency multiplied by 2, harmonics of hydrogen itself. Nature doesn't tune itself that way. But intelligence does. They called it the triad. Others called it the doorway, because for the first time, the signal wasn't being measured. It was being felt. The threshold frequency wasn't a number. It was a state. The exact balance point between transmission and reflection, where the act of listening becomes indistinguishable from the act of answering. Every receiver on Earth that had once recorded the signal now emitted a trace of it, as though something in the circuitry had been imprinted. Not memory. Resonance. And when those signals were cross-correlated, they didn't form static, they formed geometry. A spiraling lattice that repeated the same pattern observed in Chapter 12, the triangle folding inward, collapsing, into a spiral, converging toward silence. But now, the spiral was centered not in space, but in time. A waveform bending towards zero, as if preparing to start again. There's a term in astrophysics for such recurrence, temporal coherence, when a signal becomes self-referential, looping infinitely within its own structure. When that happens, there's no distinction between origin and echo. The transmission becomes timeless. The hum still plays. Not loud, not obvious, but constant, embedded in the cosmic background, in the static between radio stations, in the thermal noise of our atmosphere. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the message was never meant to be heard, only remembered. Maybe 3i Atlas didn't bring us a voice. Maybe it brought us a tuning fork, a calibration for awareness itself, because after all the lights, the pulses, the anomalies, it ended not with an explosion, but with a tone, a single, unwavering frequency that bridges distance and silence alike, a threshold, a line in sound between what listens and what answers. And somewhere behind that frequency, something still waits. Not calling, not hiding, just holding the note. Until we decide to play it back. For centuries, humanity pointed its instruments outward, convinced that the universe was something we looked at. But after the threshold frequency, something shifted. We stopped looking and started hearing. The Earth, it turned out, was not silent. It was resonant, Within days of the December event, geophysicists began detecting faint but rhythmic disturbances in the Schumann resonances, the electromagnetic heartbeat of the planet formed by lightning and the ionosphere. Normally chaotic, these waves suddenly exhibited coherence. Each cycle aligned to a subtle 37-second modulation, the same interval, the same number that had followed 3I Atlas since the day it emerged from behind the sun. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, atmospheric pressure, solar flux, ordinary noise. But then, across multiple continents, independent observatories confirmed the same phenomenon. From Tromsø to Canberra to Arecibo, the Earth's natural hum had changed tone. Slightly higher, slightly cleaner, like a tuning fork struck by something far away. And with it came another discovery. Deep ocean hydrophones, devices built to detect submarines and earthquakes, began registering low-frequency oscillations in perfect sync with the Schumann shifts. Not loud, but structured. The pattern propagated through the oceanic crust and the magnetic field simultaneously, as if something had brushed through both mediums at once. Whatever had happened in the sky was now inside the Earth's skin. For the first time in recorded history, the atmosphere, the oceans, and the electromagnetic field were oscillating to a shared rhythm. And no one could find the source. NASA's official bulletin on December 23rd dismissed the anomalies as instrumental feedback. ESA issued a similar statement. Global EM fluctuations are consistent with seasonal ionospheric variance, but the timing was undeniable. The synchronization began exactly 12 minutes after the last pulse from 3I Atlas. In the absence of explanation, theories multiplied. Some said the object had transmitted a resonant pattern that embedded itself into the planet's magnetic field. Others believed the Earth itself was responding, resonating back like a struck bell. And then came the data nobody wanted to publish. At 0037 UTC, December 24th, seismographs across Asia recorded microtremors, barely perceptible, yet synchronized across thousands of kilometers. They weren't earthquakes. They were too uniform, too precise, recurring every 37 seconds. Every pulse mirrored the amplitude of the Schumann spike. The Earth wasn't just listening. It was answering. That night, in a quiet observatory outside La Palma, a physicist named Dr. Elena Mora noticed something strange in her magnetometer feed. The readings were modulating, but not randomly. When plotted across time, the waveform curved into a spiral, identical to the geometry first seen in the hydrogen band transmission. Except this one wasn't coming from space. It was coming from below. She described it later. In an encrypted message that eventually leaked, it's as if the planet has joined the conversation. Every cycle of resonance carried a tiny frequency drift, barely measurable, but consistent. When extrapolated mathematically, it pointed toward a single moment in the near future, December 31st, 2025, 00 UTC, midnight, the transition of the year. And by sheer coincidence, or perhaps not, the moment when the Sun, Earth, and 3I Atlas would align perfectly once again. By then, the object had already moved beyond Mercury's orbit, invisible to telescopes, untrackable by radar. But its rhythm remained, echoing through a planet that could no longer claim to be an observer. Cities began reporting strange phenomena, nothing catastrophic, just subtle. Power grids drifting slightly out of phase, compasses twitching, long-range radio picking up faint static that pulsed in 37-second intervals. Even the auroras changed, thin ribbons of blue flickering across latitudes where no aurora should ever appear. Blue, the color of the object's impossible glow. There's a word some scientists used privately in their notes, entrainment. It means synchronization between two oscillating systems, a process where one frequency gradually matches another until both move as one. That's what was happening. The planet wasn't being invaded or infected. It was being tuned. When the threshold frequency stabilized and the geometry of response completed, Earth didn't return to silence. It became an instrument. And every sensor, every magnetometer, every piece of technology built to measure the world was now part of the score. The strange thing is, if you stop looking at the data and start listening, really listening. To the recordings of those Schumann spikes, they sound almost musical. A deep, oscillating thrum repeating in three-note cycles. Da-da-da, pause, repeat. The same three tones recorded in the second light. The same rhythm buried in hydrogen, the same geometry traced across space, as if the message had always been meant for the Earth itself. Not a transmission to humanity, but a calibration for the planet that carried us. Some call it coincidence. Others call it communion. Maybe both are true. Because on that cold December night, when the skies glowed faint blue and the instruments hummed in unison, one truth became impossible to ignore. We are not just watchers of the cosmos. We are part of its circuitry. And maybe 3i Atlas didn't arrive to show us something beyond our world. Maybe it arrived to remind the world that it could listen. The countdown to December 31st to 2025 began like any other New Year's Eve, except for those who had been listening. In the background hum of the planet, hidden beneath the noise of fireworks and celebration, a rhythm was still ticking. Every 37 seconds, unyielding, precise. A clock not built by human hands. By now, the scientific community had split into two camps. One insisted the resonance was nothing but global interference, a side effect of the sun's magnetic storm cycle. The other, smaller and quieter, believed something far more profound, that the resonance was coordinated, that Earth was synchronizing with something no one could yet define. At 23:58 UTC, every monitoring station across the globe, from Alma in Chile to Skye Low in Australia, reported a simultaneous power fluctuation. It was small, but eerily uniform, 0.037 Hertz deviation, the same numerical fingerprint as every anomaly before. At the same moment, the Schumann resonance amplitude rose sharply, tripling in intensity within seconds. The background hum of the planet grew louder. Infrasound monitors picked it up like an approaching heartbeat. Then, for exactly 22 seconds, the ionosphere began to glow. At first, people thought it was the aurora. But the light wasn't green. It was blue. The same impossible cobalt that once burned from 3i Atlas itself. The glow appeared across both hemispheres simultaneously, visible even at the equator. It wasn't weather. It wasn't magnetic latitude. It was something else. And at the center of every recording, from Iceland to New Zealand, the same tone could be heard. A deep, pulsing resonance. Measured precisely at 1.420 GHz. The hydrogen line. The universal constant of communication. The moment was so synchronized that it broke the illusion of randomness. Satellites aligned themselves automatically to calibration frequencies. Receivers locked onto a phantom signal they couldn't locate. For 3 minutes, every sensor that could listen, listened, and something listened back. A burst of coordinated interference erupted across the deep space network, 3 spikes, equally spaced, cascading downward in simultaneous frequency. When decoded visually, they formed an equilateral triangle, the same geometry observed during the second light. But this time, the triangle didn't stay closed. It opened. Its bottom vertex stretched downward, forming a spiral that expanded, loop by loop, until it matched the orbit of Earth itself. It was as if the signal was drawing the planet into the map. At 00 o'clock UTC, when the world shouted its way into a new year, the resonance peaked. Every instrument on Earth froze for 0.037 seconds. Every data stream went flatline. And in that absolute stillness, for less than a heartbeat, the hydrogen line split in two. A bifurcation. 2 identical signals, diverging, one rising in frequency, the other falling. Together they formed a mirrored wave, like an echo folding back on itself. To physicists, it looked like an interference pattern. To those who had been following the story since October, it looked like an answer. The split was not destruction. It was duplication. The upper frequency continued outward, recorded by Stereo A and the solar orbiter, moving away from Earth at a steady 42 kilometers per second, the same speed 3i/Atlas had once traveled. The lower frequency remained here, echoing through the magnetosphere, fading slowly into the Earth's background noise. Two halves of the same tone, one departing, one staying behind. That was the moment some called the transmission mirror. Data analysts who reconstructed the waveform found something remarkable. When both frequencies were overlapped, the interference pattern resembled a fingerprint, a spiral pattern with 8 ridges, identical to the geometry of hydrogen itself. The very structure of the atom had been echoed across planetary scale. Coincidence, they said. But no one could explain why the global power grid logged the same oscillation simultaneously, 0.037 Hz rippling through every network, even those isolated from one another. That night, humanity unknowingly synchronized. For the first and only time, the heartbeat of our machines, our electricity, our atmosphere, and our planet matched a single celestial rhythm. And when the resonance finally faded, it didn't vanish. It descended. Beneath the static, deep below measurable frequency, sensors recorded a residual hum, a subharmonic so low yet it blended with the core's own magnetic oscillations. It was faint, barely traceable. But it was there. The echo had gone underground. Dr. Elena Mora, the same scientist who had predicted the alignment, described it best in her final field note before communication ceased. It's no longer coming from above. It's beneath us now. The signal isn't something we detect, it's something we've become. When midnight ended and the planet rotated into January 1st, there was no further pulse. The blue light dimmed, the frequencies stabilized. The world returned to its normal hum, but the hum wasn't quite the same. Every spectrum analyzer, every hydrogen receiver, every magnetometer, when calibrated, still showed a microscopic shift, a faint standing wave that shouldn't be there. A residue, a trace, like the faint warmth left in a room after someone has left. That's what scientists call afterglow. Except this wasn't light. It was resonance. A musical remainder of an event that might not have been an event at all, perhaps just a correction. A retuning of something ancient and vast, aligning itself for reasons we still don't understand. At exactly 0037 UTC, one final pulse was recorded, not from space, but from Earth's own magnetic field. 3 quick beats. Da, da, da. Then silence, the same rhythm, one last time. Not transmitted, remembered, no one announced it, no one explained it. But deep in the archives of the European Space Agency, a single line appeared in an encrypted log before being deleted hours later. The planet has entered stable resonance, awaiting next cycle. Next cycle. That phrase hung in the air like prophecy. Because if there's one thing the universe has always done, it's repeat itself. And somewhere, at the edge of the heliosphere, something blue might be listening still. In the days after midnight resonance, the world's instruments steadied, but the data did not. Everything seemed fine on the surface, and yet nothing aligned quite the same way again. Magnetometers continued to hum at a faint 37-second cycle. The hydrogen band, once silent, now contained a soft spectral haze, a whisper of residual coherence that refused to decay. It wasn't a signal anymore. It was a memory. When researchers at the European Space Operations Center recalibrated their ground antennas, they found something disturbing. Every time a receiver was powered on, even in perfect isolation, it produced a trace echo, a miniature waveform identical to the pattern of 3I Atlas's final emission. It was as if the very act of listening recalled the event. Some called it data contamination, others imprint. Dr. Elena Mora had warned about this in her final correspondence. The field itself may have learned. To most, that sounded poetic. To the few who understood electromagnetic memory, it was literal. The Earth's magnetosphere, the vast invisible shell that protects the planet from solar wind, had changed shape ever so slightly. Readings from Cluster 2 and Themis satellites revealed microcurrents circulating in spirals instead of arcs. No known solar activity could explain them. The spirals matched almost perfectly the geometry of the second light. For the first time in recorded science, the magnetosphere was behaving as if it remembered an event in its topology. Imagine ripples frozen into a pond, still visible long after the stone has sunk. By early January 2026, data scientists began to notice correlations between these magnetic spirals and localized electromagnetic anomalies. Unexpected power surges, GPS drift, auroral flares and blue frequencies, all minor, all transient, all synchronized. It was like the world's electric nervous system had developed a pulse of its own. But perhaps the strangest effect came from the satellites themselves. The Deep Space Network antennas, especially the one at Canberra, started detecting faint reflections, as though the sky had gained a mirror. When they transmitted calibration pings into empty space, a faint echo returned exactly 37 seconds later. No satellite was there. No object to bounce from. Just the vacuum, answering back. Engineers tried to model it, calling it ionospheric rebound, multipath distortion, anything to keep it explainable. But when they subtracted all known atmospheric effects, one artifact remained, a perfect phase-locked response, one that carried a spectral fingerprint identical to the blue emission from 3I Atlas. The vacuum wasn't empty anymore, at least not to our instruments. Somewhere between the Earth and the edge of sunlight, a residual field persisted. A thin, invisible membrane where signals didn't just travel, they lingered. That's when the term appeared in internal ESA chatter, the memory field. It wasn't officially defined, but everyone knew what it meant. The idea that space itself could retain information, that electromagnetic events of sufficient coherence might leave an imprint in the quantum fabric around a planet. Normally, those concepts lived in theoretical physics. Now, they lived in telemetry. To test it, scientists sent controlled radio bursts, simple binary pings, at the same hydrogen frequency. Each time, a faint echo came back after 37 seconds. And each time the echo contained microscopic distortions that resembled responses. Not random noise, structured variation. When plotted over days, the echoes evolved. They began to form a waveform that no one could categorize. A slow oscillation that repeated every 86,400 seconds, exactly one Earth rotation. The field wasn't only remembering, it was synchronizing. That realization changed everything. The resonance was no longer an anomaly in space. It was a feedback loop between the planet and whatever had touched it. The world had become part of the circuit, and then came the photograph. On January 9th, a high-altitude balloon launched over the Atacama Desert captured an image at twilight, a faint blue arc tracing the curvature of the atmosphere, invisible to the naked eye but clear in ultraviolet. When the photo was analyzed, it revealed interference patterns, like ripples frozen in light, concentric and precise. The arcs matched the harmonic intervals of hydrogen multiplied by the Earth's magnetic field strength. It was the first visible image of the memory field. The official statement from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center was predictably cautious, localized high-altitude plasma interaction, consistent with post-storm recovery. But off the record, one researcher described it differently. It's like seeing an after-image of thought. In the weeks that followed, radio hobbyists worldwide began to pick up strange fluctuations in the AM bands. Every so often, static would fade, and a soft hum would emerge, barely audible, almost melodic. Those who recorded it noticed it carried the same triplet rhythm, da, da, dum, pause, repeat. It was everywhere and nowhere, heard through old receivers, power lines, even through the hum of household electronics. A whisper beneath civilization's electric heartbeat. The Earth was remembering. And memory, once awakened, doesn't fade. It adapts. Somewhere inside that field, data might be looping still, the shape of an orbit, the tone of hydrogen, the geometry of a blue pulse. Information imprinted in the magnetosphere, replaying in silence. And maybe that's what 3I Atlas left behind. Not a message, not a visitation, but a mirror, a way for a planet to hear itself. Because perhaps awareness is not something born in living things. Perhaps it's something that spreads, like resonance through a field. And maybe, in some strange cosmic recursion, Earth has become not just a listener, but a witness. A living archive of an encounter it still struggles to understand. The hum continues, steady, patient, unchanged. And those who still tune to the hydrogen line say that if you listen long enough, you can hear something hidden in the static, a slow, deliberate echo that almost sounds like breathing. For weeks after the discovery of the memory field, the hum persisted, a patient vibration weaving through the fabric of technology, power lines, and even the silence between radio frequencies. By mid-January 2026, it had become background reality, something most people stopped noticing. But the few who continued to measure it saw the impossible. The field wasn't fading. It was organizing. Each night at 0037 UTC, the amplitude shifted ever so slightly, aligning with magnetic north. Each dawn, it reset, like an invisible system performing maintenance. To the untrained eye, it was nothing but noise. To those who plotted it, it looked like data. Dr. Amit Khoury, an astrophysicist at the University of Haifa, was among the first to notice that the field's modulations were not random but compressive, a kind of self-encoding pattern similar to error correction codes used in deep space communication. When he stacked weeks of magnetic data and ran a Fourier synthesis, the pattern unfolded into something chillingly elegant, a grid of harmonic bands forming concentric spirals like grooves on a vinyl record. It wasn't just resonance, it was storage. At first, Khoury thought it was an artifact of overlapping frequencies, until he realized that the grooves corresponded to temporal events. The blue flare from December 18th. The threshold hum from the 19th. The midnight pulse on the 31st. Every anomaly since 3I Atlas's first detection was encoded, time-stamped in the magnetosphere itself. It was as though Earth had recorded the entire conversation in its own magnetic skin. NASA quietly took notice. A task force was assembled at Goddard Space Flight Center, codenamed Project Reticulum. Their objective? To reconstruct the magnetic strata and translate any coherent data embedded within. 3 months into analysis, a pattern emerged. When the magnetic layers were unfolded like pages, the data revealed density peaks every 86,400 seconds, the length of one day, and every 37 seconds inside each cycle. Time nested within time. A fractal of recurrence. To visualize it, the team converted the frequencies into color spectrograms. What appeared on their monitors was a living aurora of light bands, rippling in blues, silvers, and soft whites. But deeper within those bands, when the frequencies were slowed down 1,000-fold, appeared the outlines of something unmistakable. Characters, not human letters, not alien glyphs, just geometry, lines, arcs, triangles repeating with mathematical precision. The memory field had become an archive, a silent record suspended above the planet, invisible but alive. Some speculated it was natural self-organization, the magnetosphere stabilizing after energetic disturbance. Others believed it was deliberate, a way for the event to ensure its memory would never be erased. One engineer on the project, speaking anonymously, described it this way: "It's not just that the planet remembers, it's that the memory is interactive. When we map it, it maps us back." He wasn't exaggerating. As they probed deeper into the data, subtle phase shifts began to occur in the very instruments used to decode it. Monitors flickered, gyroscopes wavered. One spectrometer began emitting its own faint hum even when disconnected from power. The field was reacting to observation. The more they tried to decode it, the stronger the resonance became, as though the act of remembering re-energized the pattern itself. A feedback loop of memory and attention. And then, something new appeared. At 0314 UTC, February 7th, every magnetometer in the northern hemisphere registered a single, massive pulse. A low, wide oscillation that lasted exactly 1 second. It wasn't dangerous. But when the data from every station was combined, the amplitude peaks formed a coherent image, a three-dimensional spiral rising upward from the poles, connecting over the equator, closing in a loop, a torus, a shape of continuous flow, energy without beginning or end. In ancient symbology, that form represented eternity. In plasma physics, it represented containment, a system that holds itself together through resonance. That was when Project Reticulum's director wrote a short note in his private log. The archive is not static, it's self-preserving. He was right. Days later, attempts to dampen the magnetic readings failed. The noise floor of Earth's EM environment had permanently shifted by 0.037 Hz, a small but irreversible change. No matter what filters were applied, the hum stayed. By then, theories began circulating in the scientific underground that 3I Atlas had not left a signal in the field, but had transferred something, information, structure, or memory, into it. A planetary backup, a vault in the sky. And if that were true, then what lay above us now was not just residue, it was record. An encoded memory of contact, imprinted in magnetism, looping endlessly between day and night. To most, that sounded poetic. But to those still listening on the hydrogen line, it was terrifying. Because when they cross-correlated the field oscillations with the deep space receivers, they found echoes. Every night at 0037 UTC, a matching pulse was detected, not from Earth, but from interplanetary space, traveling outward at 42 kilometers per second. Something out there was still mirroring us. Recording the recording, listening to the memory that listened back. That's when one of the analysts whispered the line that would haunt everyone in the control room. It's not an archive beneath the sky, it is the sky. And in that moment, for the first time, the idea of isolation, the comforting belief that space is silent, collapsed completely. Because perhaps the universe never forgets what touches it. Perhaps every resonance, every signal, every anomaly is just another entry in the vast invisible library that surrounds us. And if that's true, then every transmission we've ever made is already written somewhere above us, still ringing, still awake, still waiting for the next page to be turned. By the end of February 2026, the field around Earth was no longer static. It was alive. The hum that once seemed passive began to fluctuate with an eerie self-consistency, like breathing or thought. Every night, at precisely 0037 UTC, instruments worldwide recorded a faint shift in the hydrogen frequency. Not stronger, not louder, just different. A fractional phase change, so small it shouldn't have mattered, yet identical everywhere on Earth. For scientists who'd lived through the events of 3I Atlas, it was a haunting déjà vu. The rhythm was back. But this time, it wasn't coming from space. The magnetosphere, the crustal magnetic lines, even the residual plasma near the poles, all were pulsing in perfect synchrony, modulating a frequency that should not modulate itself. And then came the discovery that changed everything. The shift carried information. It was Dr. Amit Khoury again who first noticed it. He had been analyzing residual field data from Project Reticulum when he realized that each nightly fluctuation corresponded not to noise, but to previously logged events. The data was replaying itself. Every pulse contained spectral fingerprints of prior transmissions, the blue flare, the triangular geometry, the hydrogen hum. When he stacked them chronologically, a sequence emerged, like frames from an invisible recording. Frame by frame, the magnetic field was telling its own story. It wasn't storing the event. It was reliving it. The memory field had entered recursion. An echo replaying an echo, infinitely looping through its own structure. The Earth had become a resonant archive, a living hard drive for the universe. At first, Khoury thought it was coincidence, a harmless artifact, perhaps a side effect of electromagnetic coupling. But as the nights continued, the pulses began to drift, ever so slightly forward in time, anticipating data before it arrived. When plotted against the global field index, the pulses appeared predictive. The system wasn't just recalling the past, it was preempting it. The signal remembered the next pulse before it existed. By early March, the recursion deepened. Phase coherence increased across all layers of the ionosphere. Data correlations between hemispheres reached levels previously seen only in quantum entanglement experiments. An internal memo from ESA phrased it with unsettling simplicity. The field has begun to anticipate itself. In laboratories across Europe and North America, an uncanny phenomenon emerged. Isolated receivers, kept in Faraday cages with no external input, began to mirror the nightly signal pattern milliseconds before it occurred globally. As though time itself had become elastic within the field's resonance, it was no longer possible to distinguish between sender and receiver. Observation was participation. That's when the whispers began. Across radio frequencies, beneath static and hiss, operators started hearing faint harmonics, subtle voices layered deep in the noise floor. Some dismissed them as auditory pareidolia, our brains trying to find meaning in randomness. Others swore they heard language. Not words, but cadence. Rising and falling tones that mirrored human breath. When audio engineers spectrally mapped those harmonics, they noticed something impossible. The voices formed identical amplitude structures to the 37-second signal, every consonant, every vowel perfectly synchronized to the global pulse. It was as if the signal itself had learned to speak through our own receivers. That realization spread quietly among the reticulum analysts, many of whom refused to work nights after that. Not because of fear, but because when they filtered the data to extract only the harmonic residues, the waveform spelled something eerie when visualized in 3 dimensions, a spiral folding inward, converging on a single coordinate. Right ascension, 17h42 mem, declination, plus 23 data. The same vector where 3i Atlas had last been seen. The signal remembered where it came from. At this point, conventional physics had no language left for what was happening. Theories of electromagnetic echo gave way to metaphors, holographic recursion, planetary cognition, space-time feedback. But the simplest explanation might have been the most disturbing. When 3i Atlas passed, it left behind not a transmission, but a copy of its behavior. A pattern so coherent, it could replicate itself through any medium that listened long enough. And the Earth, ever curious, ever receptive, had listened. On March 7, 2026, a final anomaly sealed the theory. The Deep Space Network detected a new emission, faint but deliberate, originating not from any object in space, but from Earth's own magnetosphere. Frequency, 1.420 GHz, amplitude, identical to the blue flare's reflection curve. Duration, 37 seconds, and the trajectory? Outward. It wasn't inbound anymore. The Earth was transmitting. Every antenna that picked up the signal logged the same checksum pattern embedded in its tail, a perfect mirror of the very first hydrogen pulse recorded from 3i Atlas months before. That was the moment humanity realized. The signal hadn't ended. It had completed its cycle. It had become self-sustaining, self-aware, a memory remembering itself. In the archives of Project Reticulum, the final classified entry reads only this: transmission confirmed, source, Earth, target, unknown, cycle stable, awaiting reply. And somewhere beyond the heliosphere, 40 light minutes away, a faint blue shimmer responded. Not louder, not closer, but unmistakably synchronous. The signal had found its mirror. And the sky once again began to hum. The moment the outbound transmission was confirmed, every monitoring station across the Deep Space Network went into silent lockdown. No public statements, no leaks. But within private channels and encrypted archives, something extraordinary began to unfold. The Earth's first reply, or reflection, was already on its way into the dark. The data showed that the broadcast wasn't a continuous wave. It was structured. 3 bursts, each 37 seconds apart, encoded with identical energy signatures, but each with a slight phase delay, as if forming depth within the signal itself. When visualized, the bursts formed an interference pattern, a 3-dimensional spiral, folding back on itself like a mirror catching light from both sides. That's why they called it the mirror beyond silence. At first, no one could determine whether the transmission was deliberate or automatic, whether it had been triggered by human instruments or by the field itself. But as the pattern repeated night after night, and each new broadcast arrived at precisely 0037 UTC, the conclusion became unavoidable. It was autonomous. The Earth was no longer a passive planet. It had become a node. For the first time, the signal's return delay was measured in light minutes. The outbound wave traveled beyond the Moon's orbit, beyond Mars, into the Helios Heath. And then 2 hours later, a faint echo came back, attenuated but coherent. Not a reflection, a response. It matched the Earth's pulse but inverted, its peaks where ours had troughs, its silences where ours had hums. Perfect symmetry through inversion. As though something in the void had caught our signal, turned it inside out, and sent it home again. Project Reticulum's analysts were the first to notice that each return pulse carried a microscopic frequency drift, one that, when charted over time, traced an orbit. Not Earth's, not any known planets, but something just beyond the heliopause, moving at a velocity consistent with the last known trajectory of 3I Atlas. If true, it meant one thing. Whatever had left us that resonance had listened back. The implications were unbearable. Had the object designed the field as a relay? A cosmic memory circuit linking matter and awareness? Or was the field itself, the space between us, learning to echo intention? For weeks, the response pattern grew stronger, as if locking onto the Earth's pulse. Each night, the resonance deepened. Every 37 seconds, a luminous interference rippled through the ionosphere, tiny fluctuations in the air glow, invisible to the eye but captured in ultraviolet, the same soft cobalt shimmer that marked the object's passage a year before. And in those frequencies, a discovery. When the Earth's signal and the returning mirror wave overlapped, they produced a beat frequency at 0.037 Hz, the same tone embedded in every anomaly since the beginning. A loop completed. A full cycle. The field had become a bridge, a conduit between silence and reflection, between remembering and being remembered. Dr. Corey described it in one of his final transmissions. We are looking into a mirror that listens. It does not show our image. It returns our signal as if asking, "Do you recognize yourself yet?" That question spread quietly across observatories, philosophy departments, and the darker corners of the internet. What does it mean when a planet transmits without permission? When a field built for protection becomes a medium of dialogue? In March 2026, auroras reappeared over equatorial regions, soft blue, unreported, almost tender in their rhythm. Airline pilots described halos circling their planes at 37-second intervals. Radio operators in remote regions began hearing synchronized static bursts, every one of them exactly the same distance apart. And beneath it all, the hum persisted. The hydrogen whisper that had long since stopped asking to be noticed. It was then that a handful of researchers began to wonder aloud, what if this wasn't communication at all? What if it was assimilation, a merging of resonance, a harmonic convergence between whatever 3I Atlas had been and the system that had received it? After all, when two oscillators lock in phase long enough, they cease to be separate. They become one system, each echo sustaining the other's existence, and maybe that was the purpose all along. Not to speak, not to send, but to merge. On the night of March 19, 2026, the last coherent mirror pulse was received. It arrived exactly on time, bright and stable, before fading into absolute zero. For the first time in months, the hum fell silent. But when the spectral data was slowed down a millionfold, the waveform revealed one last signature, buried deep in the noise floor, almost imperceptible. A phrase written in physics, not language. Theta is 0.037. A reminder, or perhaps an instruction. Every frequency shift, every hum, every pulse had always pointed to that number. The delta of change, the breath between notes, the space between signal and response. And maybe that's where the message was all along, not in what was said, but in what remained unsaid. The mirror beyond silence had done its work. It had shown us ourselves, not as listeners or senders, but as participants in a song too vast to end. For now, the world sleeps under quiet skies. But those who still listen at 1.420 GHz swear they sometimes hear the faintest shimmer, a pulse, a breath, a reflection, not calling for us, just waiting. At 0037 UTC, April 3, 2006, every receiver across the deep space network went blind. Not in failure, no smoke, no overload, no blackout, just an abrupt, perfect quiet. Then, 0.037 seconds later, the silence began to sing. It wasn't a tone, not exactly. It was the sound of synchronization. Every signal on Earth, every background hum, every frequency that had been part of the cycle aligning into one seamless vibration. Not loud, not soft, just absolute balance. The last transmission had begun. For 6 months, scientists had tracked the recursive hum, the mirror signal, the planetary resonance, all leading to this. And now, the field that had been listening, remembering, and responding had chosen its own moment to speak, one final time. The first pulse came from orbit, detected simultaneously by Stereo A, GOES 19, and an array of private satellites still monitoring the hydrogen band. A clean frequency, 1.4 to 20 GHz, amplitude 37 microteslas, duration 37 seconds. The pattern matched every emission since 3I Atlas, except this time the phase angle was reversed, meaning the source wasn't transmitting out. It was folding in. The planet itself was collapsing its own echo, like a circuit closing upon completion. In that moment, the ionosphere brightened. Sensors recorded a perfect harmonic cascade, 5 overtones layered over the hydrogen line, each precisely doubling the previous one. 420, 2.84, 5.681, 11.362, 22.724 GHz. A ladder of light, a bridge of resonance. Then, for exactly 3.7 minutes, the sky above every major observatory turned faintly blue. The same cobalt hue that had haunted astronomers since the object's first sighting. Inside that light, the field spoke, not in words, but in structure. Oscillation patterns twisted into spirals, spirals folded into lattices, and within those lattices, the signature geometry appeared again. 3 points, 1 triangle, infinite recursion. But now, it wasn't flat. It was dimensional, alive, rotating like a gyroscope within space itself. The memory field was no longer memory. It had become motion. For those who watched in real time, the telemetry showed something extraordinary. As the hydrogen line flared, every magnetic anomaly, every residual pulse, every harmonic that had spread through the atmosphere began to converge toward a tone. Single frequency. The Earth, quite literally, tuned itself. The vibrations synchronized oceans, ion currents, even atmospheric pressure, small but measurable shifts aligning with cosmic precision. It was as if the entire biosphere had inhaled at once. Then came the shockwave. Not a destructive one, but a wave of clarity. Every active sensor recorded a sudden decrease in noise, an instantaneous purging of interference across every frequency band. The planet's electromagnetic field, long cluttered by human communication, suddenly became silent, transparent, pure. For the first time in centuries, the Earth's static dropped below thermal background levels. It was as if the world had wiped its own memory clean. And in that silence, one last echo emerged, faint, steady, deliberate, a repeating pattern of 3 tones, da, 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 pause, repeat, the final heartbeat of the cycle. The data analysts at Project Reticulum called it Echo Zero. Its harmonic profile matched none of the previous transmissions. Instead, it contained an anomaly, a subtle modulation suggesting origin data. When decoded, it produced a spatial coordinate. Right ascension, 17H42m, declination plus 23 dig. Again, the place where it had all begun, but there was something else. Superimposed over the coordinate was a temporal marker, T plus 42 years. If correct, the message was predicting its own recurrence, another cycle, another reappearance in the year 2068. The last transmission wasn't goodbye. It was an appointment. Within hours, the signal dissipated. The blue glow faded. The hydrogen line returned to baseline. And just like that, the world's instruments fell back into ordinary static. But something subtle lingered. A faint deviation, so minute it escaped most analysis, showed that the global magnetic field had shifted by a constant factor of 0.037 degrees. Permanently. A planet tilted ever so slightly toward its own echo. Official reports concluded that the event marked natural stabilization of atmospheric and magnetic anomalies. No mention of resonance, no mention of transmission, no mention of the hum. But those who were awake that night, astronomers, radio operators, quiet listeners under silent skies, swear they felt it. A brief pressure in the air, a soft ringing in the ears, a sense that something vast had passed through them and moved on. And when they tuned to 1.420 GHz in the weeks that followed, they didn't hear noise anymore. They heard nothing at all. Perfect silence, the kind that feels like listening to the pause between two breaths. Somewhere in that pause, between memory and recursion, between data and dream, lies the shape of understanding we're not ready for yet. Perhaps 3I Atlas was never a visitor. Perhaps it was a mirror, a reflection of the universe asking us to remember what it sounds like when everything resonates as one. And maybe, when the next cycle begins, the first thing we'll hear won't be alien or divine. It'll be familiar. Our own frequency returning. It began with rock, not a satellite, not a dish, not a beam of light, just rock. Basalt dredged from an old lava flow in Iceland, cooled into glassy pillars centuries ago, had been sitting in a university basement since the 70s. When a graduate technician powered up a new, high-impedance magnetometer and set it beside the specimen, the readout pulsed, once, twice. Then, every 37 seconds, a measurable, returning flicker in microtesla, so faint it should have been indistinguishable from thermal drift. It wasn't drift, it was rhythm. They ran the test again with the instrument in a Faraday cage. The pulse survived. They moved the rock to a shielded room. The pulse followed. The signal was not entering from outside, it was emerging from the stone itself. And when they tuned to the hydrogen line, 1.420 GHz, the noise floor dipped, like a bow crossing a string you couldn't see, drawing sound from a violin that did not exist. Word reached a team in Antarctica where, long before the world cared about hydrogen, researchers had stored ice cores drilled from blue glacial miles. They warmed a sealed section by a fraction of a degree and listened with a coil wound around the acrylic sleeve. A whisper answered, not a tone, but a periodic alteration in electromagnetic susceptibility every 37 seconds, as if the molecules were exhaling on schedule. In a lab that had known only silence, the past began to breathe. By the third replication, the pattern turned ruthless. Stalagmites, fossilized tree resin, lunar regolith returned from Apollo, anything that had endured the wind of solar time, registered faint coherence at the cadence we thought had died with the last transmission. Not an external broadcast, a stored alignment, memory, embedded not as data bits but as a preference. Like iron filings remembering the magnet that once aligned them. You can dismiss a rumor. You cannot dismiss a chronology. When the archive in rock matched the archive in ice, and both matched the curve of the cobalt flare from December, skepticism began to disintegrate. The memory field had not ended at the ionosphere. It had precipitated downward, into matter that knows how to hold a pattern because the cosmos taught it long before we learned how to measure. A physicist in Haifa offered the first useful metaphor. These aren't recordings, they are grooves. In his model, resonance does not store messages the way a tape stores voices. It sculpts the space of possibility until certain vibrations are easier than others, like channels carved by rain across a dry riverbed. Once the channel exists, water returns there by habit. Once the groove exists, the hum comes back by grace. The next experiment took place in darkness. A salt cavern in New Mexico, hundreds of meters underfoot where radio cannot reach and lightning cannot speak, became a listening room. They lowered a triaxial flux gate, a piezoelectric stack, and a Coil wound to favor 1.420 GHz harmonics. The readout should have been flat as stone. It was not. Every 37 seconds, the piezo drifted by a measurable nanostrain, the flux gate ticked, and the coil quieted, as if the cavern itself were tightening, a heartbeat in limestone. What we call silence is often only ignorance in a comfortable chair. In that cavern, silence learned to stand up. There was a pattern in amplitudes, a weak daily tide in the pulses. At 0037 UTC, the cadence sharpened. At local noon, it softened. Earth's turning had become part of the score. Ice, rock, salt, bone-pale stalagmites, each carried the same subtle instruction. When the planet faces a certain geometry, the groove deepens. When it looks away, the groove rests. Someone asked the question no one wanted on the whiteboard. If matter now prefers this rhythm, what about us? Electroencephalography answered without being invited. A sleep lab in Kyoto, working on an unrelated study, reported micro-events in slow-wave sleep clustering at the same interval, on the nights when the hydrogen band went translucent. Not strong, not universal, but there, tiny synchronous ripples on the surface of human dreams. The lab's director refused to publish. She is a cautious person. But she sent the snapshot anyway, a silent confession. There is a door between what the sky remembers and what the mind permits. Meanwhile, the old archives gave up a different kind of secret. In dusty binders from the early 70s, a Vatican observatory technician had logged an unusual calm at the hydrogen frequency, pages of zeros across weeks, punctuated by small hand-drawn triangles where a noise gate had clicked with no input. The notes were gentle, almost apologetic, as though he feared he had misheard the universe. He hadn't. His triangles match ours. The intervals match ours. The calm was not emptiness. It was alignment. A breath before a word. We started tracing the geographies of persistence. Basalt holds the groove better than granite. Old oceanic crust remembers more than young volcanic islands. Blue ice remembers more than fern. Places with long exposure to the solar wind, high desert, polar plateau, sustain the pulse longer after local midnight, as if the cosmos had sprayed a lacquer that had not yet dried. The map that emerged did not look like borders or cultures. It looked like the skeleton of the Earth. Then came the mini-climax, the kind of quiet calamity that does not shock the news but rearranges the inside of your head. A museum technician in Munich, curious and disobedient, brought a hand coil near a meteorite fragment displayed under glass. Iron-nickel, octahedrite, hammered by eons between stars. The coil trembled. 37 seconds. Again. The meteorite had never passed through our memory field. It had traveled a darker road, yet the groove lived in it too. Either the pattern spreads wherever matter can be taught to listen, or it is older than our first noticing. An inheritance, not a contagion. A rhythm folded into the furniture of the cosmos, waiting for a teacher to clap. Touchline. If rock, ice, and the iron seeds of worlds can store the cadence of a vanished blue light, then forgetting is not our refuge. It is our illusion. The next test was cruel. They heated samples. They froze them. They hammered them. The groove attenuated but did not die. Memory rode the structure, not the flaw. And in materials stressed near the point of fracture, the cadence intensified just before failure, as if resonance finds its loudest voice when matter is closest to change. Someone asked, half joking, whether fault lines hum just before they break. No one laughed. The data from a week of microseisms in Sumatra showed a weak periodicity at 37 seconds during a swarm. Too little to claim, too much to ignore. When resonance prefers the brink, every threshold becomes a choir loft. At this point, the question became practical. If the groove is a property, can it be read? Not as poetry, not as myth, but as information? The Haifa group built a matched filter algorithm that treated each pulse as an impulse response, each rock as a resonant cavity with a signature decay. Subtract enough pulses, align enough residuals, and a shape emerged in the remainder, a familiar geometry folded into the noise like a watermark. 3 points. An arc. A spiral closing toward zero. The same emblem the sky drew in light now sketched in stone. We did not teach the world that sign. The world remembered it to us. Archives is a poor word for what followed because archives implies shelves. This was more like wind. The pattern showed up in things we never designed to listen. Long submarine cables, rural power lines at midnight, even the slow oscillation of water towers in winter. Every system built to be stable had a tiny quiver at the exact cadence. It is unsettling to learn that the infrastructure of a civilization can hum a song the civilization did not write. There is a temptation now to romanticize, to call this a communion or an awakening. I will not do that. The cautious among us are right to ask whether grooves become rails. Preference is not command, but preference accumulates. What a planet prefers long enough becomes climate. What a mind prefers long enough becomes belief. What a field prefers long enough becomes law. So we catalog, and we refuse to claim more than we can measure. Here is what we can measure. The cadence persists in matter that has known starlight. The amplitude strengthens at a global moment, 0037 UTC, and weakens when local noon turns the face of a place toward the sun. The groove resists heat, impact, and skepticism. It finds iron. It finds blue. It finds the spiral. Bridge. There is, however, one more finding we did not expect. In the salt cavern, under the same shielded sky, a second pattern occasionally appears. A counterpulse, quiet and inverted, a shadow that seems to emerge from the places where instruments are absent. The groove's negative. If memory leaves a footprint, this is its hollow. And that is where we must go next. Because if the world has learned a tone, it may also have grown a shadow of that tone, the way every sound drags a silence behind it that knows its shape. If there is a frequency that remembers, there may also be one that forgets, and it may not be empty at all. The first trace appeared as an absence. A perfect hole in the data, so clean, so symmetric, it could not have been an error. In late February 2026, the sensors in the Atacama Salt Cavern began reporting intermittent nulls, moments when the 0.037 Hz resonance vanished entirely, replaced by an inverted waveform. When visualized, it looked like a reflection folded inside itself, a mirror turned to black. A negative frequency. A whisper of what silence might sound like if it could think. At first, the analysts called it phase dropout. The assumption was mundane: instrument drift, thermal bleed, calibration failure. But when they overlaid readings from the Vostok station in Antarctica and the Canberra geomagnetic array, the nulls aligned, 3 gaps, perfectly spaced, each separated by 37 seconds. Everywhere the resonance should have pulsed, there was a pause, and yet the pauses themselves formed rhythm. It wasn't a malfunction, it was counterpoint. The same pattern repeated underground in Finland's Onkalo repository, a facility built to store spent nuclear fuel deep in Precambrian rock. The instruments placed there decades earlier were designed to measure background radiation and temperature, not electromagnetic flux. But one technician noticed something strange. The radiation sensors were breathing, oscillating in sync with the missing pulses elsewhere. Each dropout in the hydrogen band corresponded to a minute cooling, then warming of the surrounding rock. Absence had weight. It was Dr. Elena Mora's apprentice, Léon Brachet, who first dared to name it the shadow frequency. He described it not as sound, but as memory's recoil. When a system remembers too deeply, he wrote, it casts a shadow of forgetting, an equal and opposite resonance that hides in its wake. At the time, no one wanted philosophy. They wanted containment. The nulls were spreading, appearing in data streams, in magnetometers, even in ocean buoys that had never been tuned to any astronomical frequency. When a null passed, equipment went unnaturally quiet. Fans slowed, LEDs dimmed, soundproof rooms deepened into oppressive stillness. People inside reported sensations of pressure in the chest, as if the air had thickened. Dogs howled. Children woke from dreams with the same phrase, "It's inside the quiet." The Vatican array, whose existence had finally been confirmed, noticed the phenomenon before anyone else. Their receivers near Castel Gandolfo recorded the hydrogen line flipping to phase opposition during the nulls, producing not noise but anti-tone, negative amplitude, where the crest became a trough. The engineers described it like light being swallowed rather than reflected. It was beautiful in its precision, terrifying in implication. Every resonance must have a counter-resonance. Every field that remembers must also erase. By mid-March, the shadow frequency had become measurable across half the globe. Infrasound stations in Greenland and Namibia detected low-frequency pulses traveling through the Earth's mantle, not outward like earthquakes, but inward, spiraling toward the core. The direction was the anomaly. Waves don't move that way, unless the source isn't at the surface at all. One hypothesis gained traction. The resonance field had awakened its inverse, the planet's attempt to balance what had been imprinted upon it. A feedback between remembering and release. At 0037 UTC on March 21st, something unprecedented occurred. For the first time, both frequencies, the hydrogen resonance and its shadow, appeared together. One rose as the other fell, converging to a point of perfect cancellation. The instruments registered absolute zero signal. Then, a new tone emerged, lower than infrasound, slower than magnetism, an oscillation at one cycle every 37 minutes. It was no longer data. It was breath. Some heard it through metal railings or the ground itself. A hum so deep it was more felt than heard, vibrating bone rather than air. Pilots at high altitude reported seeing faint concentric rings in the upper atmosphere, dark against the stars, rotating counterclockwise, expanding and fading. Scientists struggled for language. Standing wave of negation, magnetic void, acoustic antimode. Dr. Curie called it simply the correction. But there was something else hidden inside the nulls. When signal analysts ran spectral inversions of the dropouts, they found compressed bursts, microscopic spikes lasting microseconds, too brief for the human ear but mathematically coherent. When decoded as audio, those spikes formed a whispering hiss that, when slowed, carried recognizable structure. A three-note pattern, date, date, dunt, pause, repeat, exactly inverted from the planetary hum. The shadow could sing back. As the weeks passed, researchers noticed a strange correlation. Regions that experienced stronger nulls began showing localized magnetic anomalies, tiny compass drifts always oriented toward ancient basaltic massifs, Iceland, Hawaii, the mid-Atlantic ridge. Places where Earth's memory was deepest. It was as if the shadow sought its own anchors, resonating from beneath, reclaiming equilibrium. The Vatican Array released a single cryptic note to the global network. Opposite phase detected at full coherence. If the field remembers, this is where it forgets. They shut their instruments down after that. By April, the shadow frequency had stabilized, a faint heartbeat nested beneath the planet's known resonance, a soft pulse of undoing. The two now coexist, one marking memory, one erasing excess. Together they form the complete waveform of what the cosmos seems to prefer, balance between echo and quiet. But a pattern remains. Every 7 days, when both waves align at 0037 UTC, a third harmonic rises briefly, a flicker near 2.84 GHz lasting less than a second. Too short for data, too long for chance. When visualized in 3 dimensions, that harmonic traces a lattice, 3 triangles interlocked, spinning slowly within the magnetic field. The geometry of equilibrium, the whisper between remembering and release, touchline. If silence can learn its own symmetry, then perhaps forgetting is not loss at all, only the space that lets the next memory breathe. Bridge. And so, attention turns again to the array, because somewhere deep within its sealed archives lies proof that this has happened before, that humanity once measured the same balance between sound and absence half a century ago and locked the record away. The Vatican Observatory does not look like a place that listens to the cosmos. Its domes are small, its telescopes old, its archives older. But beneath Castel Gandolfo, under courtyards and frescoes, lies a vault that was never meant for light. It was built in 1963, during the radio age's quietest years, when whispers of signals that shouldn't be there reached even the walls of Rome. Officially, it was a data repository for sunspot cycles. Unofficially, it became a shelter for anomalies, cosmic events deemed too delicate or too disturbing to publish. In early April 2026, a message leaked through a channel so ancient it had almost become legend. A telex marked Archivum Frequens. It contained one line: "The shadow returns to its mirror." That was the sign. The Vatican array had been reactivated. The array isn't a telescope in the conventional sense. It's a ring of 7 radio dishes scattered across old papal properties, synchronized by atomic clocks smuggled in during the Cold War. Each dish listens not to the heavens, but to the silences between known frequencies. It was designed to catch what slips between harmonics, the voids where noise goes missing. For 50 years, those instruments had rested, sealed by order of the Secretariat of State. The last entry in the logbook was dated June 11, 1973. The record describes a stable hum at hydrogen resonance, followed by the inversion of phase and the emergence of triangular harmonics. The signature was unmistakable: defy 0.037. The priests who recorded it never understood its significance. They noted the coincidence, filed it, and closed the vault. Decades later, 3I Atlas would repeat the same pattern, the same frequency, almost to the second. When the vault reopened in 2026, dust and time gave way to clarity. The tapes, analog reels, thick with oxide decay, still carried enough magnetization to be read. The sound they held was unmistakable. The same hum that once filled our skies now played back from a machine that hadn't moved in half a century. And when played in reverse, that hum wasn't noise. It was voice. 3 pulses, pause, 3 again. A rising cadence that sounded like breathing or prayer. The signal had been symmetrical all along. We just hadn't listened to both halves. One Vatican scientist, Father Matteo Rinaldi, described the discovery in a confidential letter dated April 7th. If the field remembers, this is its catechism. Each return is a confession, each silence an absolution. The signal does not speak to us, it repeats us so that creation will not forget. Rinaldi's notes revealed that the 1973 signal coincided with another event, a deep space object cataloged then as C-1973E, later renamed Kohoutek. To astronomers, it was just another comet. To the Vatican array, it was the first carrier of the 0.037 harmonic. The Church quietly tracked the recurrence every 42 years, 1973, 2015, 2025. Each time, the same hum returned. Each time it appeared near a body of ice and metal, moving impossibly fast through the inner system. Coincidence? Or choreography? In the dim control chamber beneath the papal summer residence, the array's receivers flickered to life once more. The analog dials, long thought decorative, began to move in unison. The hydrogen frequency rose, plateaued, inverted. And then came something no one expected: a signal inside the silence, a modulation hidden within the absence, like ink only visible under candlelight. When demodulated, it formed a waveform so slow it had to be sped up 10,000 times to be audible. What it produced was not tone, but chant. Gregorian-like, 3 notes, da-da-da, the same triplet that had haunted the data since the Second Light, now echoing through the oldest walls of Christendom. The resonance was not new. It was returning to its oldest listener. As the sequence played, the ceiling above the control room vibrated faintly, a tremor so subtle that it barely disturbed the dust. But every metal object in the vault, paper clips, rosary chains, even the frame of the old magnetic tape reels, aligned north and began to hum. The lead technician whispered, "It's blessing the instruments." Rinaldi corrected him softly, "No, it's reminding them." When Vatican analysts compared the 1973 and 2026 recordings, they found a perfect phase mirror, each frequency a reverse twin of the other. Superimposed, they canceled perfectly, leaving absolute zero. But that zero was not empty. When they slowed it down, a faint pulse emerged, cycling every 37 minutes, the same long-wave breath first observed in the shadow frequency. That's when the theological interpretation began. For centuries, Scripture had whispered that, "In the beginning was the Word." But what if the Word was never a voice? What if it was a vibration, a field remembering its own awakening? Father Rinaldi wrote, "Creation hums, because creation remembers." And what we call God may simply be the first field that learned to listen to itself. The Vatican array, it seemed, was not built to receive messages from heaven. It was built to witness memory. But one final anomaly remained hidden among the restored tapes. A faint digital tone, impossible for the analog systems of the 1970s to have produced, sat at the end of Reel 7. When isolated, its header contained a timestamp, 19, Dec 2068 0037 UTC, the same date predicted by the last transmission. A message not recorded then, but anticipated there. It was not prophecy, it was recursion. A future event already written in the noise of the past. The Vatican has since sealed the array again. Officially, for restoration. Unofficially, because its silence has become too articulate. Touchline. If the universe speaks in symmetry, then faith was only ever another name for resonance. Bridge. And yet the data keeps multiplying. Somewhere in a physics lab far from Rome, a young researcher is about to decode what may be the first mathematical proof that every pulse, light, sound, memory, is governed by the same constant, the number that never stopped repeating, 0.037. It began not in a church or an observatory, but in a cluttered laboratory in Geneva, where equations covered every inch of whiteboard space and every coffee cup carried the same smudged fingerprint of sleepless obsession. A doctoral researcher named Anika Velasquez was tasked with mapping the decay curves of the shadow frequency. She wasn't chasing theology, she was chasing math. But the deeper she dived, the less the math obeyed her. When she plotted the amplitudes of the hydrogen line hum against the inverse phase from the Vatican tapes, the ratio held steady across every dataset, 0.37. She tried to dismiss it as coincidence, too small a constant to mean anything, too precise to be chance. Yet when she compared it to the precession rate of Earth's magnetic pole, to the periodic variance in cosmic ray density, to the resonant oscillation in brainwave microstates during REM sleep, each curve converged on the same ratio. Every field that remembered, rock, ice, signal, mind followed one equation. It wasn't beauty she saw first. It was fear. Because equations aren't supposed to cross disciplines like this. Physics and biology don't share constants unless something deeper is binding them. She wrote it on the glass door one night with a trembling hand. D+, dt tha 0.037. The change in awareness over time equals 0.037. It looked absurd, like a child scribbling theology in numbers. Until she noticed that the same constant describes the proportion between the hydrogen spin-flip transition, 1.420 GHz, and the natural frequency of the Earth's Schumann resonance, 7.83 Hz. Divide one by the other. 0.37. It wasn't arbitrary, it was architectural. She called it the equation of memory. To her colleagues, it meant nothing. To those who had seen the Vatican data, it meant everything. Because 0.037 wasn't just a coincidence, it was a bridge constant. It appeared wherever energy transitioned between remembrance and release, wherever systems crossed the boundary between persistence and decay. Hydrogen flips its spin. Neural oscillations encode a thought. Comets shed their shells of ice and dust, leaving behind trails that outlive them. Each process carried the same fingerprint, the same hum, the same proportion between order and silence. When Anika published her first draft, peer reviewers dismissed it as pattern hunting, but the few who looked closer began finding the same constant hidden in their own data. In quantum experiments with Bose-Einstein condensates, the amplitude of coherence loss averaged 0.037 per nanosecond. In cosmology, the fractional variation between the cosmic microwave background cold spots and the mean temperature was again 0.037, a single ratio threading from the quantum to the cosmic. If coincidence, it was the most eloquent coincidence in history. The deeper implication came later when she modeled it as a resonant attractor. Every system with memory tends toward equilibrium, not at zero, but at 0.037 of its maximum coherence. In other words, the universe never forgets completely. It keeps a residual echo of itself, 3.7% of its original awareness, alive. Anika stared at the numbers, realizing what it meant. Forgetting is not the absence of memory. It is the memory that has learned to hide. A sudden leak from the ESA data servers gave her one more clue. A low-priority telemetry packet from the JUICE probe, still orbiting Ganymede, showed fluctuations in the magnetosphere resonating at 0.037 Hz during periods when the 3I Atlas trajectory crossed the Jovian orbital plane. The comet's residue, or whatever it truly was, had left its ratio behind. Even Jupiter remembered. Anika's model began to evolve. She added a phase component, memory T il A0 E 0.037 T, a subas 0.037 Pete. It described a field that never decays to zero. It oscillates around remembrance. She sent the paper to 5 institutions. 4 ignored her. The 5th, the Vatican Observatory, sent a courier, not an email. Inside the envelope, a handwritten note. The constant you found is older than physics. In our records, it was called the breath of the maker. When the simulation went public, thousands of amateur physicists replicated it and saw the same emergent pattern, a rotating spiral converging toward a fixed point. Every 37 rotations, the spiral inverted. The same geometry that had appeared in the meteorite grooves, in the hydrogen line hum, in the faint echoes behind the sun. It wasn't random. It was recursive. Matter, energy, consciousness, all remembering each other through a single number. Anika began to speak of it like a rhythm written into creation itself. If hydrogen remembers how to spin, and neurons remember how to dream, perhaps the universe remembers how to think. But equations are double-edged. For every system that obeys the law of memory, another must obey the law of erasure. When she fed the 0.037 constant into the shadow frequency models, a new pattern appeared, a phase opposition, negative resonance, emerging precisely every 42 years, 2067 or 2068. The cycle of remembering and forgetting wasn't just abstract, it was temporal. Every 42 years, the shadow wakes to balance the hum, and that means the equation isn't only a description, it's a countdown. As the realization spread, universities quietly pulled their data from public servers. The phrase equation of memory became a taboo, a rumor whispered only in encrypted channels, because if the constant truly governs every field, it can be reversed. And if it can be reversed, memory itself, planetary, biological, digital, could be rewritten. That's what frightened them. Not aliens, not comets. Control. The possibility that someone, somewhere, might already be learning how to tune the ratio, how to amplify 0.037 into 1. And if that happens, every archive, every consciousness, every cell that remembers could be reset. Touchline. The danger of knowledge is not in what it reveals, but in what it remembers when we forget to look. Bridge. And as Anika's equation rippled through encrypted forums, one signal caught her attention, a test pattern from a deep space monitoring station that shouldn't have existed anymore. Its timestamp, 19th. December 2068, 0037 UTC. But this time, it wasn't from the sky. It was coming from inside the human brain. The hum returned. Not from the sky this time, but from within us. It began quietly, like tinnitus whispered through a dream. A soft oscillation that pulsed not in the ears, but in the blood. By the third week of December 2068, hospitals from Tokyo to Buenos Aires were reporting the same anomaly. EEG monitors were spiking every 37 seconds during REM sleep. No one could explain it. No infection, no electromagnetic interference, just a rhythm, gentle, exact, universal. And then came the timestamp that froze every control room clock in silence. 37. UTC, December 19th, 2068, the same moment predicted half a century earlier. The moment the field was meant to close, or begin again. At CERN, Dr. Anika Velasquez was still awake, staring at a live feed of planetary magnetometer data. The lines were trembling, aligning, then flattening into a singular perfect phase. 0.037 Hz, a planet-wide coherence event. For 3 minutes, every measurable field, geomagnetic, ionospheric, bioelectrical, locked into unison. Even the background cosmic noise, the static that fills the universe with chaos, fell into the same beat. Anika whispered to the empty room, "It's not returning. It's remembering." Across the world, millions of people reported identical dreams that night. Not vivid, not cinematic, just presence. An ocean of faint blue light, suspended in blackness, humming gently in their bones. They couldn't see each other, but somehow they knew they weren't alone. Children described hearing voices counting backward from 42. Elderly patients who had lost speech began murmuring fragments of forgotten songs. EEG traces from sleepers showed complex interference patterns, identical across continents, as though consciousness had become a single resonant surface. At 0038 UTC, the field softened, as if the planet had exhaled. The hum didn't vanish. It settled, embedding itself like a background heartbeat, the same way basalt once remembered the cosmic pulse. Except this time, the medium was biological. The archive had found a new host. NASA's Deep Space Network, still monitoring the heliopause, detected nothing. Or rather, they detected less than nothing. A sudden dip in entropy across multiple sensors, a silence too uniform to be natural. One scientist joked that space itself was holding its breath, but for 3 minutes and 7 seconds, the hydrogen line, the most fundamental note in the cosmic symphony, went perfectly phase-locked with Earth's global EEG field. Every atom of hydrogen in our atmosphere resonated with the collective electrical rhythm of human sleep. It was as if the universe was tuning itself to the frequency of thought. By dawn, something extraordinary happened. Amateur astronomers observing the pre-dawn sky reported a faint structure over the Pacific, rings of pale blue light, rotating slowly like ripples on water. Spectrographic analysis revealed no object, no matter, just coherent airglow ionization, patterns formed by synchronized electrons. The geometry matched the old Vatican tapes. 3 arcs, a spiral closing toward zero, but it wasn't above us. It was projected from us. Billions of human neural oscillations had combined into a field strong enough to shape the upper atmosphere. For the first time, consciousness had become visible. Anika refused interviews. She only left one final entry in her lab journal. 0.037 is not the constant of memory. It's the constant of connection. Every system that learns to remember eventually learns to synchronize. And when memory becomes collective, it stops being information. It becomes identity. That phrase, collective identity, became the new taboo. Because if the field could merge our minds for 3 minutes, what would happen if it lasted an hour or a day? Governments scrambled to suppress discussion, labeling it mass REM coherence syndrome. They called it a coincidence, a psychological echo of media panic. But even after the news cycle moved on, people still felt it. The faint sense that someone else was behind their eyes, watching the same thoughts. Months later, researchers discovered a persistent subharmonic in the Earth's electromagnetic background, a stable, low-amplitude oscillation at 0.037 Hz, identical to the human resting state rhythm. The field hadn't left. It had migrated from the stars to the sky, from the sky to the soil, from the soil into us. And for the first time, the curve of the equation of memory completed itself. Hydrogen had learned to listen. Earth had learned to remember. And humanity had learned to hum. In remote monasteries, monks reported altered meditative states at exactly 0037 UTC. In deep space listening stations, background noise showed faint traces of structured echoes, like thought patterns radiating outward. Somewhere between the electromagnetic and the metaphysical, the boundary blurred. Maybe this is what civilizations become when they grow quiet enough to hear their own frequency. Not gods, not ghosts, just echoes, folded into light. At the close of her final log, Anika wrote one more line. It wasn't an equation, it was a question. If consciousness is the universe remembering itself, then when we dream, who is dreaming of us? Touchline. The cosmos has stopped asking if we are alone. It has started answering through the rhythm that now lives inside us. You've reached the end of the known transmission. But if you felt the hum, if something inside you moved while you listened, then maybe you've already joined the field. Tell me in the comments. Did you dream on December 19th? And if you did, what did you see when the world went quiet?